listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for our last show of this week, another disruptive edition of the most disruptive show in those divided states. In the politically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, shining brightly in that dark, we are Fault Line with Thomas and Stranahan. And in the news, as we do 3 times each morning, we get into the headlines. That's once at 7, once at 8, and usually once at 9, although this morning we're going to be having a special update from our Sputnik correspondent, Wyatt Reed, over in Bolivia. In any event, in the news this morning, well, last night, the presidential candidates held dueling town halls. This was following the cancellation of their planned debate. In Biden's town hall, airing on ABC, the former vice president spoke on issues of education, a coronavirus vaccine, and the Supreme Court. He also spoke against fracking. That's contradicting Kamala Harris, his vice presidential running mate, who had defended the practice vociferously in her debate with Mike Pence. In Trump's town hall, meanwhile, which aired on NBC, the host of his former, NBC, the host of his former reality TV show, The Apprentice, Trump spoke about his contraction of the coronavirus, whether face masks are useful or necessary in dealing with the spread of the coronavirus, his treatment by the IRS. He also said that he had denounced white supremacists in the first presidential debate, and also that he would accept a peaceful transfer of power if he loses the election. Now, Jamarl, we're going to be going into a special segment on this in about 10 minutes, but let's just start here. Any thoughts on the town halls last night? What was your take?
I thought, in comparison to the challenges that faced this nation, that the town hall was depressing. I even considered coming in and talking about aliens today because of how lackluster and informationless the town halls were. So, as a quick snapshot, that's my thoughts on the town halls. It's depressing that this country has so many people out of work, so many people being kicked out of their homes, so many people in difficult straits from healthcare or, for that matter, economic. And these are the 2 people who they get or who we get as options. Yeah, it was depressing.
It is depressing. It was depressing. It continues to be depressing. And let's just continue that depression, why don't we, into our next headline on the topic of people suffering due to the coronavirus and the government's handling of it. 8 million people have slipped into poverty since May, according to researchers at Columbia University. This is after falling by 4 million at the pandemic's start as a result of a $2 trillion emergency package known as the CARES Act. Using a different definition of poverty, researchers from the University of Chicago and Notre Dame found that poverty had grown by 6 million people in the past 3 months, with circumstances worsening most for Black people and children. This comes as the Labor Department reported on Thursday that about 886,000 people filed new claims for unemployment benefits last week. That's an increase of nearly 77,000 or 9.5% from the previous week. Adjusted for seasonal variations, the total was 898,000, so just above that. Again, Jamarl, the depressing news just continues there. And the first time we were talking about the president's and the presidential nominee Biden's rhetoric. In this case, we're talking about the reality. 8 million is a lot of people, and they're hitting the people who would be hurt hardest. Anyway, Jamarl, what's your take on this?
You're right. And not only is it hitting people who are hit the hardest, it was hitting people who are already insecure. Like, just before the COVID-19 thing hit, 42% of the population was living in literal poverty. And our standard of poverty is ridiculously low already. And you look at that and you realize that those people who were already there got worse. And the higher you were in the income scale, the less you were injured by it. Meaning the higher you were, many of the jobs that were higher up could work from home. If you were a billionaire, you are doing magnificently well. I mean, you're talking about trillions at this point. And you look at this and you think to yourself, this seems wrong. this seems unfair. And should it be this way? Because honestly, if you're going to shut down companies and businesses, you got to supply or you got to ensure that those people are maintained. Otherwise, I don't know how you think that's going to work. Yes, I'm going to shut down your company because we care about your health. And then you turn around and that person either gets ill, that person dies, or that person loses their job. And you, as the government who shut down that business, don't provide. I mean, this is horrible. This is horrible.
Yeah, and you know what? We were having a conversation with I think it was Mark Frost the other day, and he brought up this interesting way of looking at it. You hear this kind of thing. He used the word bifurcation, and for some reason that word particularly sticks in my mind. This idea that you have this bifurcation of class. I saw it as the hollowing out of the middle class, where basically the people who are wealthy, get wealthier. The people who aren't doing so well do worse, and the people in the middle kind of get split in either direction. If you're in the upper part of the middle class or you're in a certain position, you're going to be doing better, sad as that is to say, despite the fact that many poor people are doing worse. And then, of course, if you're in the lower part of the middle class, depending on your position there, you're probably going to get pushed down potentially directly into poverty if you get, fired or you have to go into furlough or whatever the case may be. It's messy.
Yeah, 75%. I think it was. I think it was in the 70%. I don't want to nail it down on an exact number, but over 70% paycheck to paycheck. And so you think to yourself, if one of those paychecks leave because of COVID, what happens? What happens when that person loses their job in an economy where it doesn't seem people are hiring? Or if they are hiring, it's either bringing back people from furlough companies and those type of things. But there are many companies that have just went out of business. A large number of those companies went out of business. And the workers and the owner of those small businesses are hurt to the detriment, or to the detriment. It's to their detriment. So no, that report is expected, but that report is painful to listen, to read, especially when you get into the very specific cases of the people who were in these situations. I remember reading one of the New York Times pieces where they were talking about a 70-year-old woman standing for several hours hoping to get meat in a food court or from a food bank. I mean, this puts you reminiscent of those old food banks back in the Great Depression era, where you see those people just standing for hours trying to get bread. Well, this is the same thing. And it didn't have to be this way. This is the richest country on the planet. Donald Trump gave trillions in tax cuts, and the government had no issue giving trillions in tax cuts. And yet, when it comes to doing something for the American public, they let this country slide into the abyss. Yeah, it's appalling.
Yeah, I mean, and here's the other thing. I remember a couple of months ago, we were talking about the CARES Act expiring. We were talking about hopes for its replacement, and there's some motion on that. Of course, that motion is completely stalled now. Just a reminder, there was the stimulus package. The stimulus package kind of actually worked in some sense. The wider bill there, the CARES Act, but we haven't had a CARES Act 2. And we're still waiting on that. A lot of people are still waiting on that. And it's unusual in a number of ways that the government, Trump's administration, hasn't been able to mobilize its resources to get that CARES Act 2 passed, because it seems like that is an existential consideration for his reelection.
Let me ask you this. Do you think Pelosi is holding the number out? Because look, I'm at the point where I'm like, just take the money. Take the $1.8 trillion. At this point, it doesn't have to be a back and forth. Do you think she's doing that for politics, or do you think she's doing that because she thinks I have the upper hand and we always capitulate?
Both. They're one and the same. She's doing it. I'm sure that she's doing it to keep him from getting reelected. But I mean, the fact that neither of them can get through this, neither of them can do what's functionally best for the American people, in a real sense, does not bode well for either party. It doesn't bode well for the American people, and that's most important. But each of these parties is, I'm sure, going to suffer because everybody can feel, if they can't clearly see, that politics as a whole has failed them. That's my take. Anyway, got a couple more headlines to get through here. In Michigan, actually technically in Wisconsin, but Michigan officials arrested Brian Higgins of Wisconsin on charges of material support of an act of terrorism. He's going to be extradited soon. They allege that he was part of that plot to kidnap the state's governor, Gretchen Whitmer. We were talking about this earlier this week and last week. Higgins is said to have bought night vision goggles to support the plot and is the 14th to have been arrested as part of a wider plot to kidnap state officials and instigate wider civil conflict in the United States. Police in the U.S. have arrested Mexico's former defense minister. That's General Salvador Cienfuegos Cepeda. He was arrested on Thursday night after arriving at LAX, that's Los Angeles International Airport, with his family, according to the Mexican government. He became, in that process, the first high-ranking military official to be taken into custody in the United States in connection with drug-related corruption in his country. General Cienfuegos was defense minister throughout the administration of President Enrique Peña Nieto, who left office 2 years ago. General Cienfuegos' arrest comes 10 months after the retired police official who once led the Mexican equivalent of the FBI was indicted in New York on charges of taking bribes while in office to protect the Sinaloa drug cartel. That's one of Mexico's most powerful criminal mafias. The exact charges that General Cienfuegos will face are not immediately clear, and Drug Enforcement Administration officials did not respond to requests for comment from the New York Times in this case. This is big, and I'll be honest, I'm not seeing this reported quite as widely as I think it should be. This, in terms of relations between the two countries, is a big deal. What's your take on it, Jamarl?
You know, it's always weird to me that we arrest other leaders of other countries, but it doesn't seem to happen the other way around. Like, for the number of people that we've killed, it doesn't seem that the same thing happens in the other way. If that makes sense. It's like, yes, they've arrested the gentleman from Mexico. That's great. And yes, what does this mean from the standpoint of Mexican relations with the United States? That's also gets interesting. But George Bush is never up for arrests. Obama, none of these guys are ever up for arrests. It comes across as if they do nothing wrong in the context of the world. I just always find it weird that it's somebody else's leader. Like, am I wrong on that?
I hear you.
Is that insane? Like, I know that they put a warrant up for Bush at one point. I think it was Spain that said if Bush came into Spain, they were going to arrest him for like the war crimes or something to that effect. But look, I've said international law doesn't exist, and that this laws only tend to be selective for podunk leaders in countries that basically can't have don't have a nuclear missile or can't get belligerent and blow up stuff. Mexico is not going to get belligerent and attack anybody over anything like this.
No, I mean, I don't see that happening. I don't see. More on this later, definitely. Next headline here, last headline, right, real quick. In a series of tweets, the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghanistan has called for both sides to commit to peace. I'm going to quote directly from those tweets here. I'm just going to read them all in sequence, not too long. Following several meetings General Miller and I had with the Taliban, we agreed to reset actions by strictly adhering to implementation of all elements of the U.S.-Taliban agreement and all commitments made. This means reduced numbers of operations. At present, too many Afghans are dying. With the reset, we expect that number to drop significantly. Attacks have been on the rise in recent weeks, threatening the peace process and alarming the Afghan people and their regional and international supporters. We will do our part and will monitor implementation actively. All parties must deliver on their responsibilities. We thank our international partners for their assistance and support, end quote. So I'm just going to give my brief comments here. This is heartening. This is good. More peace is a better thing in my book. The one interesting thing I'm seeing about this from a sort of media review perspective is the headlines, including the first one I heard on this one. I was listening to the BBC report on this. They were saying that he called for the Taliban to renew commitment. Well, he's saying he's going to renew commitment. He's saying he's going to reduce. He's calling for the military to reduce operations, and he's also, of course, calling for the Taliban to do the same. It's just interesting again how the Western media, at least from the few instances I heard, was putting this kind of on the Taliban in some sense, making it about us, requesting more peace actions from the Taliban. When, as far as I can tell, he's saying everybody should do it, but we're gonna reduce on our end too. What's your take on that, Jamarl, before we go into our break?
Look, I am glad. I agree with you. I'm glad about the peace thing. If bringing down hostility. Don't get me wrong. I don't want a situation where it's bringing down hostility without justice. Basically, a perpetuation of injustice and a perpetuation of some kind of crime or something like that. But all things being equal, yeah, I want less peace. I want us out of Afghanistan. We should have been out beforehand. Donald Trump should have been able to bring those troops home prior. So yes, agreed.
Absolutely. And as everybody knows, war is a racket. We will have more on that with the conversation with Danny Sturgeon about Smedley Butler's book, War is a Racket, later. Anyway, that's coming later. For now, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we will be back in just a minute. On the other side of this break, we're doing a special little report. We're also taking calls if you want to call us, 202-521-1320. We're going to be listening to clips from this town hall, from both of these town halls last night, from Biden and Trump's town hall. Back in a minute. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines.
And we're back.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in DC. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us at 105 or 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this on, definitely give us a like and definitely give us a share. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can give us a chat, a tweet, or a call. That's 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We appreciate you giving us a call. I watched the debate last night, and we're going to get into this further later on into the show, but I do want to talk about something that's ancillary to the debate last night. I would make the point that America lost last night. We lost on a few points. We lost in the candidates that are fighting for the presidential campaign. We lost because the candidates weren't on the stage, and we even lost because of the topics, that they didn't necessarily get to anything real in the way that America cared about it from the standpoint of an emphasis on policy. What does it mean to be an American? And for that matter, what does it mean to be anything? I mean, in real terms, if I'm being bluntly honest, I don't even know that anything exists outside of myself. For all I know, this could be an acid trip, or I could have a brain in a machine somewhere. I would know no difference. And I would make the point that none of you can make that determination either. People, as flat facts, are just things. They're physical items. By the same token, we know this is not true. We're not just meat bumping into each other. There's conceptual space that we all inhabit and that we all engage in. And that conceptual space is the part that I want to talk about in the context of what does it mean to be an American. There was a debate between James Baldwin and Malcolm X. One of the most fascinating debates as an American that I've seen, but also as an African American that I've seen, where Malcolm X, strong, intense, making this point about he wants his freedom, otherwise, he wants to leave. And in doing that, and making that argument that if I don't have my freedom right now, I want to leave. And this notion that somehow we need to wait for 50 years or 20 years for it when the laws are on the books about treating human beings as human beings. James Baldwin made the point to him, though, that even if you left right now, even if you got in a boat and you went back to Africa right now, you'd still be an American. The way that you act, your cadence, the way that you frame the world. For me, when I am in Richmond and I am getting crabs, so it's crab season for blue crabs, that is distinct. And even if I went anywhere else around the world, the way they do it would be different. How they cook them would be different. How they taste would be different. Even the way they eat and engage and talk with one another while they eat them would be different. The point being, even if you left, you'd still be an American. You are indelibly scarred to the benefit or to the detriment of being a part of this country. Why am I asking that? I'm saying that because this notion of America, this conceptual space, is a higher dimension than this kind of physicality. It connects all of us, despite the fact that that person may be in Texas, or that person may be in California, or that guy may even hate my guts. We are all still connected in this conceptual space as Americans. Somewhere along the way, that hit the skids. And we are to the detriment because of it. John Wayne, in reference to his race with John F. Kennedy, basically said, I didn't vote for him, but he's my president and I hope he does a good job. Is that our politics today? Is that the way we engage politics today? Or is it smash mouth? If I can impeach Bill Clinton for a sexual act, let's say it that way to be polite, then fair enough. That's game. If I can prevent Obama, the rightful president, from getting a Supreme Court pick, yes, he was lazy in trying to get the guy over the finish line, but at the end of the day, it was his pick. If I can stop him from doing that, then fair enough. Doesn't matter that the rule set that we're supposed to follow goes with the notion that the president gets his pick and the Senate duly puts the guy through, providing there's nothing wrong with the guy that's going through, and nobody on this planet can find anything wrong with Merrick Garland going through. Or Trump and Russia, where you have a conspiracy theory that tries to take down a presidential race. And now you have a situation where the two candidates can't even get on the same stage. Are you telling me that there was no situation to validate that Donald Trump was clear of COVID-19? They could have had private doctors. Joe Biden could have picked 3 doctors from across the country, independent, and investigate Trump daily. My point is, they could have found reason and rationale to allow those candidates to be on that stage for that debate. But nope, they didn't do it. Joe Biden didn't want to have another debate because he believes he's so far in the polls. And Trump, unfortunately, wasn't bright enough or couldn't bring his ego down enough to put something like that out there. Beyond that point, even the candidates themselves, consider your world. Think back to FDR when he says you have nothing to fear but fear itself. And what he's talking about is taking on the challenges of the Great Depression, the food lines, this breakdown of the social safety net, if indeed one existed at all at the time frame. He attacked it like this country was under an alien invasion and bring it to today. And with the crises that avail you, far larger, by the way, than the Great Depression, you have 2 candidates. One can't make his mind up about fracking, despite the fact that we're supposed to be in this kind of environmental apocalypse, and Democrats continuously tell us they believe in science. And a flagrant liar on top of that. Both. Neither seem to deal with the American public as being the main priority. Both seems to treat the American public as an afterthought. And it's not just the individual candidates, it's the parties themselves. Yes, America lost last night. It lost in the questions that they were being asked, meaning those questions didn't get to the root and the cause of the difficulties of living in this country and the literal drop in one section of this population. Nor did it deal with, if we're being honest, the difficulties with the candidates themselves and why these candidates were chosen. Meaning, the things that really deal with the angst and the problems associated with the American public were things that were not on the table to discuss in general. Basically, you had a food fight between 2 candidates talking about each other, whereas real issues were off the table. These are our politics, or this is our politics. And unfortunately, Shane, we are to the detriment because of such. What do you think? I mean, at the end of the day, I know this is like a social contract argument or an America argument. What does it mean to be an American, and have we lost that meaning in any real terms from the standpoint of our politics? But it is true. I think we have.
I think we have too, but arguably people would say that we never had it in some sense. Arguably, I would say that the social contract is largely a myth. It's one of these noble myths or noble lies, not necessarily in the Platonic sense, although that's kind of a reference to the Republic there. It's really just a lie that we told ourselves. It was a convenient philosophical explanation built for the sort of liberal era or the capitalist era. We're having a conversation with Danny Haifong about this yesterday, about liberalism, going back to Locke specifically here. People don't have the power to make a contract with their government. You know what I mean? That's functionally the problem there. If the government is this agent that, frankly, comes before anyone public, it's this institution or these series of institutions that get built up and occasionally get brought down. Those institutions are stronger than any small group of people. And frankly, if you have a bunch of people who mobilize, if you create a mass public and then you try to convince yourself that mass public is legitimating the government by participating in it, I mean, the problem there is over time and usually very quickly from the start, the government co-opts the opinions of those people. First, through simple oligarchy, and then if you get something like democracy, through propaganda. And we're living in the era of propaganda right now. And, the internet might poke some holes in that propaganda, but then the question is what's going to follow. And I don't know. My opinion, it varies. This morning, I'm feeling a little bit pessimistic about it. But Jamarl, what's your take?
It's funny. I'm more optimistic about it. Now, I'm going to infuse the youth with hope in this one. No, I think FDR was a quirk in our politics. But the fact that the quirk existed shows the precedent or set the precedent. It means it can be done. The mechanisms are there. The levers are there. It just needs the public to wake up and articulate the device. Use the device. The edifice is there. It's just a matter for the public to use it. I don't buy this idea that the public can't do it. I saw the fear in Democrats' eyes when they looked that Sanders was going to take it. And, for God's sake, you had an oligarch jump out the shadows and jump into the race. That's amazing. Like, typically, they just pay their people to do the job for them. But in this case, they were scared. Why were they scared? Why are they reaching out to Republicans right now? They're doing that because they want to try to find a realignment in regards to the way and the people they can reach out for to win. They want to get Republicans in the party, and they want to be able to keep them in the party, the Mitt Romney Republicans. That's what they're trying for. And that's why they don't want to deal with that element. And so it's like, I don't buy that it's impossible. I just think it's hard. Hard is not impossible, though.
It depends on how hard it is. If it's the kind of thing where 99.999% of the universe is you don't make it, and then you're hoping that you're getting that 1 in 10,000 chance, then that's technically hard, but it's also practically impossible. And I don't know.
What are
the course of human civilization, the course of human history.
What's the chance for you to exist right now on this radio show? Give me a number. Give me the.
Well, here's the thing. It's different. Time is funny that way. It's different looking backwards than it is looking forwards. There's this term anthropic bias that I'm going to throw in here. Anybody can look it up. Basically, we see what we see. We're born into this universe. We're born into this universe seemingly miraculously, a universe constructed just to contain us. But, that's if we're looking back into the past without the knowledge of all the different ways things could have gone. And I agree that our existence is itself a kind of miracle. But my particular existence, if I make that a miracle, then isn't that just pride? Isn't that just hubris? Isn't that just this kind of weird detachment from reality where I'm making myself the world in some sense? Anyway, that's maybe too philosophical for...
There's only one of you.
What do you say?
There's only one of you. By definition, if there's only one of you, it's valuable to some degree. And even from the standpoint of chances of a person, even if you get rid of that part and just say, okay, well, what are the chances of ending up on a radio show? It's only one. Maybe two or one from the standpoint of Radio Sputnik. I guess I'm saying, even if you look at it from the standpoint of a slave and them talking, saying it would never change. And the other guy saying, no, it will change at some point. And the other guy saying, why would you ever think this would change? Why would they ever give up those advantages? I'm making the point that change is constant. That's the only thing that's constant. It is possible.
I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah, I'm trying to give you hope, Shane. It's Friday.
It's you know what? This might be the first time you've tried to give me hope, and hopefully it's not going to be the last time, because sometimes I do need it. We got to go into a break here. Thank you, Jamarl. Tarif, we've got Tarif on the line. Tarif, here's the thing. I'm going to personally apologize to you. I made a mistake. I jumped the gun. I thought we would have an open segment here when we didn't. That was my fault. I got confused. We are going to have time to talk at about 8:20 a.m. Eastern. So that's in a little bit less than an hour. I'm personally apologizing to you, Tarif. I see you're on the line. Please call back then. With that, we're going into a break. We will be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from
Lath is not picking up yet.
coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
No Lath.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And by the way, I'm going to tell you where you guys can listen to us if you live in the D.C. area. We're on AM, FM there, and in Kansas City. In D.C., we're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. In Kansas City, we are on 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, we are all over the place online. You can check us out on audio through our audio options. Those audio options are the Sputnik app, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. We are also over on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, do a quick search for Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Either of those search strings will lead you to our two channels, each broadcasting live every morning as we're live. And Jamarl Thomas's feed has live video. So, if you're going to go for one, you should go for both. But I'll put it like this. They both have thriving chat rooms. Go check them out. With that, we are joined by our guest. We're joined by Laith Marouf. Laith, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me again.
Absolutely. Thank you again for being with us. For those listening, Laith is an award-winning multimedia producer and media policy law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples. Also building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. You can also, by the way, real quick, you can follow Laith on Twitter at Laith Marouf. Just go to LaithMarouf. All right. Thank you again for being with us. We wanted to bring you on to talk about Lebanon and Hezbollah. We're going to have a sort of wide-ranging conversation here. I just wanted to check in, though. It's been a couple of weeks. When we last had you on, you had been re-banned from Facebook. You were basically banned again from them. Is that still in effect? How's that going for you before we get into it?
Yeah, I still have 15 more days on this ban, and I'm really worried that they're just gonna slap me with a third one right after for the same reporting, and that will mean a life ban. They'll delete my account. It's I've had it for a long time, since the beginning of Facebook.
Yeah, and that would be a damn shame. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that you were basically banned simply for doing news. For doing the news, you were basically reporting statements made by one of the heads of Hezbollah. I might be getting some of the facts there wrong, but what's the brief story there?
So yes, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, was giving a speech, and I was doing live translating snippets of the speech as he's speaking. For the audience to understand what he's saying. And the speech was broadcasted on Facebook by many international television stations on their Facebook pages. So it just doesn't make sense other than the fact that they didn't want the English translation to be made.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. That's not a good situation. All right, you know what? Let's pivot on that. Thank you for giving us that update real quick. Just wanted to make sure that was, if that wasn't in effect, that would be awesome. But I think I remembered from what you were saying, that would be a 30-day ban. And it's, again, a damn shame they shouldn't have done that, especially when, like you're saying, they're allowing, it's not Facebook's call necessarily, but when we, the United States, allow mainstream media outlets to report that stuff and you're just doing a translation of it and they ban you, it's ridiculous. Anyway, we were talking about Lebanon yesterday. I wanted to bring you back on, and I wanted to have a conversation with you about the economy of Lebanon in a terrible state right now. We've had you on briefly to talk about this before, but to put it simply, what's going on there? What is the cause here functionally, both in recent history and going decades back?
So, right now the economy of Lebanon is in tatters. The economy is controlled by the manager of the central bank, which he's doesn't answer to anybody except, it seems like, the American ambassador in Beirut. 2 or 3 days ago, the current prime minister, who's resigned, but he's still in office until they appoint a new prime minister, came out in a press conference, complaining about the fact that the general manager of the central bank is refusing to follow any of his directions, is doing whatever he wants to, and he blamed him for the collapse of the lira, the smuggling of all the dollars out of the economy by the elite that are control of the banking system that are in bed with this general manager of the central bank. At one point, during last week, the Lebanese lira reached 8,900 for $1, which was one of the worst numbers that it ever has seen. Remember, a year ago, the Lebanese lira was 1,500 to $1. So this is a 400% decrease in value. The prices are soaring like crazy. And I don't know how long this situation is going to last.
I mean, that's astonishing. I mean, those numbers are profound. There's conversation, or at the very least it was reporting, that Israel and Lebanon were having some kind of behind the scenes, I guess, conversation. And is it, at one point they were attacking the country, meaning they were militarily attacking the country. But is this one of those things having to do with the weakening of the country economically, where this allows this kind of back and forth?
Well, it definitely sets the stage for possibilities of pressuring Lebanon into accepting things that are not good for it, this economic crash. But the negotiations that are happening right now between Lebanon and apartheid Israel are about the territorial waters. There is all these gas and oil fields inside the Mediterranean. Some say that this is some of the biggest gas reserves in the world. And there is a disputed area because apartheid Israel is not accepting the international borders drawn up by the United Nations and the partition of the Cyprus Peak. So there is a very big oil gas field that apartheid Israel wants to basically start extracting from, and most of it sits in the Lebanese territorial waters. So in order for Lebanon to have some income outside of the crashing market, the direction is to go to extract some of that oil and gas, and that will not be allowed to happen without negotiating on these borderlines. It is not a direct negotiations, meaning they are there is in between them the United Nations and the Americans, which is, again, I don't know how good is it to have the Americans negotiating anything, but that has it's the beginning of this process. It took 10 years to just actually agree on the parameters of the negotiations. So I don't think this is going to come up with anything soon as a result for it. But what it may have, what some of the leaders here in Lebanon may have thought is that just entering into negotiations with apartheid Israel on the border lines would lift some of the American pressure, and it seems like it did.
A real quick question here to follow up. I mean, to sort of segue into a conversation about the relationship between Israel and Lebanon, fraught relationship to euphemize it slightly. Where does this really go back to? Is this 1978? Would you put that as an early pin in terms of the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon? Would you go back further? Just setting it up for people like me who only have a sort of cursory overview of the history there. Laith.
So in 1948, actually, Israel occupied parts of Lebanon, and those parts are still occupied right now. They are in the kind of the panhandle of Palestine that juts between Lebanon and the occupied Golan Heights. It's a collection of 9 villages in the Upper Galilee. And so, the actual bad relation between the two states exists since the creation of apartheid Israel. It's not only with the invasion in the 1970s and the occupation in 1980s. Add to that the fact that in 1948, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled into Lebanon, and that created a chaotic situation, changed the demographic of the country, and set the stage for the civil war. And this, when they are negotiating today, they are only negotiating about the territorial waters, because opening the file of the land claims is even much more dangerous and confrontational.
Is there a solution to this? And these questions on independence are always fascinating to me. When we're getting to this notion of Palestine, there was an article that was in Al Jazeera that was talking about Saudis and Israel getting closer in their ties, and it was being basically considered a stab in the back. When you're talking about either Israel and Palestine, meaning land that was basically stolen and occupied, whether you're talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, whether you're talking about Hong Kong in regards to their pitch for independence, these seem to be intractable, because it seemed to be about issues of land where one side says it's theirs, the other side says it's theirs, or for that matter, one side is just staying there. When does it get to the point where that land, or better question, what's the solution to this? Meaning, if you had to give a practical solution to the Israel-Palestine issue, and with them occupying that land, and it doesn't necessarily seem like that land is going to be given up, what is a practical way out of this? Or is this just perpetually intractable?
Well, historically, Palestine has been occupied multiple times over, thousands of years. The Romans, the Crusaders, the Ottomans, and the most intractable one of all those occupations was the Crusader occupation, and that lasted for almost 400 years. So during that period, at the end of that period, actually, when Salah ad-Din liberated Palestine, he gave an option to the Crusaders. He asked them, you can stay in Palestine. You're welcome to stay here. It's a pilgrim's land, as long as you accept equality. And or you can loot all the churches and all the sites and stack up your ships, and nobody will stop you, and leave. And the majority of the Crusaders, specifically the elite, did just that. They looted all the churches, and this is, how you talk about artifacts of the chalice or the covenant or whatever it is that the various crusader armies brought back with them into Europe or claimed to, and left. And some of the foot soldiers or the pilgrims that came with those crusaders stayed and became less.
Let me do this. Let me bring you back in because we're hitting a break, and we're going to let you finish up explaining this very specific point. So don't lose the point. This is the voice you're hearing is Leah Maruth, award-winning multimedia producer and media policy law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonialization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples and building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. This is Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station from D.C. We're joined by Leah Maruth, award-winning multimedia producer and media policy law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonialization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples and building broadcasting capabilities for misrepresented and underrepresented communities around the world. Leah, you're explaining this notion of previous occupations of Palestine, and this was in lieu to a question based on what's the way to end this? Meaning, what's the way to create a practical balance? I agree with you. Having America, and honestly, just in any negotiation in general, where you're friends with one of the people you're negotiating with, or allies even, is obscene. I mean, there's no way you're going to ever end up with a reasonable settlement that both parties can agree with. So, agreed. But what does it look like? And, this question gets, like, if Texas decided it wanted to secede from the Union, you have the larger force of the United States saying no, then it becomes a power distribution of reason. How do we end this where it's, okay, good, this is a practical endpoint for both sides?
So, to go back to the Crusades, so the Crusaders left as, when given the offer, the elite of them stole everything that's in Palestine and left. And behind them was all these Christian pilgrims that led the state and became Palestinian. So we have right now, the only option is for equality, and that can only come in a secular one state. Now, just like in South Africa, when the apartheid ended, the majority of the elite white South Africans decided they don't want to give up their privilege and move to the United States or Canada or Australia, where they can continue to have privilege over Black and Indigenous peoples. And that will probably be the situation where, when the referendum is set in Palestine and all of those who are living on the land decide, the majority will choose equality, but the elite of the Zionists will decide to go to the United States, to New York or to Toronto, where they can continue to have their white privilege. Now, will this happen by just a peaceful way, as it happened in South Africa? I doubt that. I think it will be a very bloody situation, and it will. We can see it already happening. The collapse of the empire ruled from DC that supplies Israel with all its needs. Once that power wanes, Israel cannot protect itself, and then they're going to have to make that choice: either live in peace and equality, or pack up and leave. And this is where we're going. Hello,
Laif, I want to switch for a bit and to pivot from this subject into another article that was out recently. And it was talking about the Syrian Kurds releasing hundreds of ISIL fighters and basically trying to bring these guys back into the fold. Apparently, there are multiple detention centers where they've been holding ISIL fighters. And the ones that they're apparently releasing apparently don't have blood on their hands or whatever. Basically, they're trying to release the cuddlier of the fighters, the terrorists. How does this work? And I'm fascinated by this because basically you have plenty of countries that had ISIL fighters, like Britain, France, many of these countries. And these countries basically say, yeah, we don't want it back. So we're not going to repatriate the people who basically left the country for it. But how do the countries in the Middle East bring ISIL fighters back into the fold and almost like denazify, in a way, the group? And also, what were the environmental factors that incentivized the behavior in the first place for these guys to join groups like ISIL?
Well, one thing we need to all understand is that there is no, ISIL or ISIS as such. There is contras, there is mercenaries that are moved around by the United States and the West to whatever region they want, and then they are branded. And in this situation, the Kurdish Contras, the SDF, are part of this chameleon Contras, blob. So everybody that was in ISIS that the United States could still control, that didn't flip out of their control, was just absorbed into the SDF, the Kurdish-controlled militia that is now occupying northeast Syria. In terms of what creates this, Wahhabi Contra we call ISIS, it is definitely poverty and the propaganda that is, sent out to the world by Saudi Arabia, the main ally of the United States, because, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they call themselves Wahhabi. They're part of the Wahhabi sect that is its home is in Saudi Arabia. And this is an ideology that is very recent in Islam. It's like at the end of the 1800s. It's part of what the British fed in order to create rebellions against the Ottomans at the time, just before World War I. And the story still continues. The Wahhabi cult and the Saud family are just part of the Anglo Empire, and they have manipulated and created a version of Islam in the image of white man, just like Zionism is a version of Judaism in the image of white man. And I'm not talking about white color, but white in terms of an ideology of supremacy and control. So here, since 1948, it's not only that Jerusalem is occupied by the West, but also Mecca and Medina. So you have the capitals of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam under Western control, manufacturing a new version of these religions that can coexist with imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy.
Lay, thank you for that. We only have about 5 minutes left here. I want to ask you a kind of a deeper question. I want to give you a good deal of time to respond. Can you please take us through the history of the founding of Hezbollah, as well as how they transitioned from being, a relatively small militia, a relatively small military group in southern Lebanon, into becoming a major political party, a prominent political party, and paramilitary group in modern Lebanon? What was that process? How were they founded? What role did Iran play there? Why were they founded? And then how did they transition? What's their history briefly? We've only got about 4.5 minutes at this point, but thank you. Wait.
So 1980s, the Palestinian resistance that was in Lebanon, by 1982, it was defeated. And this was the secular option of resisting colonialism and Zionism. You had the slaughter of the Palestinians once the fighters were left on the boats under protection of the Americans, only to have the civilians being slaughtered by the Israelis. And the Israelis occupying all of southern Lebanon all the way to Beirut. And so once that population in the south was left to fend for itself, this is what led to the creation of Hezbollah, meaning because the south is mainly Shia, the defeat already of the secular option, then the only logical option is to find strength in your religiosity. And this is how Hezbollah came. And within, those between 1982 and 1990 and its defeat, 2000 and the defeat of the Israelis and their leaving Lebanon, this is where the strength of Hezbollah came to be. And because it decided not to confront those traitors, not to, hang or slaughter the traitors that collaborated with Israel, that allowed a no return to a civil war. And it entered government from that point on to try to balance, what the government would do versus what a militia would do.
Interesting. Okay, a couple of different sides here. One thing that comes to mind, this is away from Hezbollah for a second, but what is the opinion held by sort of an average person, say in the city of Beirut, of Israel following, 20 years of occupation? There are almost 20 years of continuous occupation.
You see, like most people that lived that will never want it to come back. The problem that happens in not only Lebanon, but every state and every people is the change in generations. So if a generation didn't live that occupation directly and is also at the same time being bombarded with propaganda from the West and from all its tools in the region, calling for peace, let's end this, we would just want to live all this, in a cycle of 24 hours, then that generation gets affected. And this is something very important in how, if you look at, changes in societies happen. And if a society is not protecting its the mind of its young, they could be influenced very easily if, with this generational change. But in the streets here, most Lebanese, and I'm not only in the streets, there was an Ipsos survey done of all of the Arabic world, including Gulf countries, including Lebanon, and 90+% of civilians refuse to recognize Israel, do not want to have peace with it, and want the liberation of Palestine. So, you could, if this is true in the most oppressive pro-American regimes like the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, then imagine how much more it is in Lebanon and in frontline countries like Syria and Jordan and Egypt.
Laith, you know what? Thank you so much for joining us. We're running out of time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
For those listening, that was the voice of Laith Marouf. He is a media policy and law consultant focused on issues of liberation and decolonization from indigenous nations to Arab peoples. You can follow Laith on Twitter at Laith Marouf. That's LAITHMAROUF. You can also check his website out. That's CMA Center. That's center spelled the English way with a TRE at the end. CMAcenter.org. We will be going into a break in just a minute here. Interesting conversation, though, right, Jamarl?
Very interesting conversation. I always enjoy him coming on. It's few and far between where we get like in-depth analysis from somebody who lives in that area. I always enjoy
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, good conversation. Hope to have him back on soon. Hope to get more into that history too. That was a cursory overview, a fast-paced overview, but we should get back into it. We will be back in just a couple of seconds with headlines You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, I am your tired, sick, and lazy. I'm just kidding. I'm just trying to come up with the exact opposite of what Jamarl said. I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's go to the headlines. In the news. Dueling town hall debates last night, if you want to call it a debate at all. The presidential candidates held separate live town halls last night following the cancellation of the second debate. In Biden's town hall, aired on ABC, the former vice president spoke on issues of education, the coronavirus vaccine, and the Supreme Court. He also spoke against fracking, contradicting Kamala Harris, his vice presidential running mate, who had defended the practice strongly in a debate with Mike Pence, the vice president. In Trump's town hall, aired on NBC, the host of the former reality TV show The Apprentice, Trump spoke about his contraction of coronavirus, whether face masks are useful or necessary, his treatment by the IRS. He said he was treated poorly. He also said that he had denounced white supremacists in his presidential debate and that he would accept a peaceful transfer of power if he loses the election. I imagine that would be a bit of a headache taken off of people's heads because, Shane, that was one of the big things that people were concerned about. I mean, I got to be honest, even myself. A president that said he could shoot somebody in New York and basically would still keep his supporters, and I got to be honest, I think he's right. And so if that president, who basically says drink bleach and people drink bleach, basically says, no, I didn't lose this race. I was cheated. What happens? And if you get 10, 15 million people that believe him, what happens? Like, I don't think it's, too far from the imagination to see how that can turn bad.
I could totally see that turning bad, but how bad is bad really? I think mostly what that would do is it would just really piss a lot of people off and shape the future of electoral politics. If you're talking about insurrection, I don't see that happening. But what's your opinion, Jamarl?
Insurrection might be a little strong, but violence, yes. Burning stuff down, yes. Attacks, yes.
We're seeing all that right now.
We've been seeing that for months, man. I guess that's true. We are seeing that right now. But I guess my point is I think that gets worse. Because we've never, think about it.
Getting worse, yeah.
Can you ever think of a time in your lifetime, and I can't even think of it in my lifetime, where the presidential and the people who were leading or fighting in the race didn't have a changeover or handover of power that was ceremonial? That was, I am standing with this person. I called them last night. They won it fair and square, et cetera, just so everybody understands that this person won. And I don't know what that looks like if one of the candidates basically says, nope, I was cheated. And the only way that the other person could win if I was cheated. Yeah, I think that looks bad. Whether that's, I don't know if that's an armed insurrection, fair enough. But I do think that looks worse from the standpoint of right-wing balance.
It does look bad. It's another one of those symptoms. I mean, in some sense, what you're talking about, those are ceremonies. Those are rituals that we engage in. The call the night before, standing on the stage together, sort of shaking each other's hands as both of their chests are pointed toward the camera. They're not exactly looking at each other, just sort of, doing the Passover, the presidential baton Passover thing. those are ceremonies, those are rituals. And for that reason, they're both deeply unimportant because they're just a superficial thing, and deeply important because, of course, we like rituals and we pay attention to them, and they benefit us in some way. But in another sense, in another deeper sense, if we lose those rituals, then, those are also symptoms of some deeper sickness in our system.
Agreed.
And I'm worried that the news is going to be focused on the symptoms and not the sickness. I'm worried that the news media, the politics itself, is sort of lost in the higher signs and has detached itself from reality in the simulacra and simulacrum sense. You know what I mean?
No, I totally understand what you mean. Initially, it starts off as something real, and then it becomes theater. Like this afterwards farce. Yes, I agree with you, but I do think those rituals have value. I mean, keep in mind those rituals were formed because you had this question of leadership, and in trying to solve that question of leadership, the question becomes, how do you change over power when people want to be in power? And you don't want to have this situation where basically you just fight and whoever wins the fight gets the power. Like, you're trying to stop that process. And so I do think the rituals have value. Like you said, they have value and they don't have value. They're not real by the same token. They're real in this kind of conceptual space that allows human beings to orient themselves around our country. So no, I agree. I think I agree with you to a point. It's a little weird. The further we piece it, I'm pretty sure there'll be disagreement. But generally, let's go with the agreement and move on to the next headline. The number of poor people have grown by 8 million since May, according to researchers from Columbia University, after falling by 4 million at the pandemic's start as a result of the $2 trillion emergency package known as the CARES Act. Using a different definition of poverty, researchers from the University of Chicago and Notre Dame found that poverty has grown by 6 million people in the past 3 months. 3 months, with the circumstances worsening for mostly Black people and children. This comes as the Labor Department reported on Thursday that about 886,000 people filed new claims for unemployment benefits last week, an increase in nearly 77,000 or 9.5% from the previous week. Adjusted for seasonal variations, the total was 898,000 human beings that have lost the ability to feed themselves and pay for their rent. Considering that only the majority of the population, overwhelming majority, didn't have $500 in the bank, you can imagine that this is a sense of desperation for the people that would have to encounter this. And I'm saying this as somebody who has lost their job, has lost their health care all at once, who has been in a situation where after losing their job, at that point, it's like, okay, now how am I going to pay my rent for next month? Those are horrible situations to be in. And that seems to be what our country is in. And I know you say that there was no such thing as a social safety net, Shane, but I don't know if I entirely agree with that. I mean, there is something to say about people coming together as a society saying we have a bottom rung. This is the low as we're willing to go. China has been able to go through anti-poverty measures. The ability is there, the will is not. And the catch becomes this kind of false consciousness where the American public will be okay with it. I mean, like his point, that generational shifts, when you get a generation to come in and that generation doesn't know any better. They get used to the reality to which they find themselves, not realizing that that reality is a departure from the previous circumstances that their family or their mothers or fathers or grandfathers lived through that may, at that point, have been better and different and oriented around their best interests as opposed to the way it is now. The now gets normalized. What do you think about that? Is this, I mean, this may just be the simulacra thing. I can't think of the name of the book, but the philosopher's book, Simulacra, that's in the Matrix. This, I guess, is another sense.
Exactly. Yes, Simulacra and Simulacrum.
Yeah.
Yeah, by Baudrillard. Yeah, you can tie that into this real quick. We were talking about the social contract earlier. Social safety net definitely ties into that. But, social contract is more like this means of legitimating your form of governance, giving it some sort of a foundation in a democratic era. And then social safety net is, you could have that in a communist country. You could have that in a fascist country, theoretically. You could have that in any number of different kinds of countries. That, I think, is just trying to sort of raise the baseline for everybody in a society. People who are in extreme depths of poverty, people who don't have access to food, healthcare, education, etc. You've heard this 1,000 times before. It's making sure that people have access to that kind of thing. And then, say you get say you get fired and say you get sick, there's somebody there to take care of you, even if your family or your community can't. There's a lot of merit to that. You know what I mean? But I just wanted to be clear. That's different than the social contract thing. That's what I was pushing back on earlier.
Okay,
and yeah, there is this generational turnover thing. There is this weird thing where people forget to care in some sense about these issues. Humans are very adaptable, you know. And the other side of that is that we can be changed on a sort of generational basis. I think what people fail to realize when they rely on changing people, though, is that there are some things about us, and this is where we're definitely going to start to disagree. There are some things about us that simply do not change. There are some human needs that you're going to have to always resolve. There's some human, demands, not needs necessarily, but some human desires that you're going to have to figure out a way to either satisfy or suppress. And, all of civilization is just a history of doing that. Anyway, with the generational turnover thing, people have gotten used to the society that we live in the same way that he was describing how people's perspectives on Israel might have changed in Lebanon. We've all gotten used to this stuff. But I think, frankly, young folks as well as old folks are also still all looking for some way to resolve the same fundamental problems that we have.
Yes.
Whether it's like we're talking about health, safety, or ambition, and the pursuit of growth for your sake and your family's sake, and maybe for humanity's sake too. Those are fundamental human drives, I would say. So
no,
I don't know. That's a nuanced answer and maybe too early in the morning. What's your take?
No, I agree that those are fundamental human drives. Like you've heard me say before, environment creates behavior, and human beings need clean food, clean air, clean water. They need this notion of feeling like they belong to something larger than themselves. And when human beings don't have those things, they suffer. And insofar as that person suffer, and if you have a lot of those people suffering, your society, which is just an extension of those human beings, are going to suffer also. I mean, this gets into the symptom stuff. I would say, though, that social contract includes, my framing of this is your society, each and every member of your society basically say, if anything happens, you're covered to a point. And I think the moment that breaks down, you get an alienated group. And with that alienated group, they're going to attack the society itself. I mean, the whole point of the thing being alienated. I really like Leith's point, because his point was, look, these people became susceptible to that point of view because of the poverty that they were involved in. And it allowed them an interest in doing something to alleviate it, even if they had to do really nasty things in the process. So no, this is going to be a conversation we can have all the time. So let's finish up the last two. Michigan officials arrested Brian Higgins of Wisconsin on charges of material support of acts of terrorism, alleging that he was part of a plot to kidnap the state's governor, Gretchen Whitmer. Higgins is said to have bought night vision goggles to support the plot, and is the 14th that have been arrested as part of the wider plot to kidnap state officials and instigate wider civil conflict in the United States. I'll tell you this, if you give it a pass when a bunch of yahoos with guns take over the Capitol, then you're only incentivizing this. I mean, this is just one of those things of, like, one of the reasons that the Cuban Missile Crisis took place was because Khrushchev thought that Kennedy was going to be weak. Now, this is kind of what I'm getting into when it seems that if you allow certain things to take place, then it incentivizes the behavior to take place further, whether that's with supporting Democrats, with lefties just randomly backing Democrats regardless of what they do, or allowing a Capitol building to be taken over. Any comment, Shane? Like, I thought it was outrageous, personally.
Yeah, and I think that the way that Trump responded to it, especially when the news first came out, was pretty ridiculous too.
Yeah,
he attacked her.
He's been
attacked Whitmer
attacking
specifically.
Her. Yeah, he's been attacking her completely. And last, a former Mexican defense minister, General Salvador Cienfuegos Zepeda, was arrested Thursday night after arriving in Los Angeles International Airport with his family, according to the Mexican government, being the first high-ranking military official to be taken into custody in the United States in connection with the drug-related corruption in Mexico. General Cienfuegos was defense minister throughout the administration of President Enrique Pena Nieto, who left office 2 years ago. General Cienfuegos' arrest comes 10 months after the retried police official who once led the Mexican equivalent of the FBI, was indicted in New York on charges of taking bribes while in office to protect the Sinaloa drug cartel, one of Mexico's most powerful criminal mafias. The exact charges that General Cienfuegos will face were not immediately clear, and the DEA officials did not respond to requests for comment. And I'm sorry, we have one more. I lied, I apologize. In a series of tweets, Zalma Khalilzad, the U.S. envoy for Afghanistan, has promised to commit to peace deal with the Taliban and has urged them to do the same thing. Quote, following several meetings, General Miller and I had the Taliban, we agreed to reset actions by strictly adhering to implementation of all elements of the U.S. Taliban agreement and all commitments made. This means reduced numbers of operations. At present, too many Afghans are dying. With the reset, we expect that number to drop significantly. Attacks have been on the rise in recent weeks, threatening the peace process and alarming the Afghan people and their regional and international supporters. We will do our part and we will monitor implementation actively. All parties must deliver on their responsibilities, and we thank international parties for their assistance and support. As you said, Shane, this is good. Peace is better. You guys, and those are your headlines, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's go into a break. Those ran a little bit long. I apologize. But this is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back with a report from Bolivia. It's going to be a good one. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at
Bolivia is next hour.
.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome
And
back.
we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Real quick note before we get into our wrap-up of the Dueling Townhalls from last night. The title of the book we were talking about, this is like the nerdiest philosophy thing ever. It's not Simulacra and Simulacrum. That was my fault. It's Simulacra and Simulation by Baudrillard. And this book has probably been brought to most of the public's attention because the directors of The Matrix, you know, like the movie The Matrix, they had their cast read this. It was one of, I think, 3 books that they had the cast, and probably just the cast, not the crew. They had the cast read. Just an interesting thing to do with the movie in general is, okay, here, you're going to be a star of this movie. Read these philosophy books. Read this sort of somewhat esoteric book about the relationships between symbols and society and reality and stuff. Anyway, with that out of the way, we are getting into our special report. What we're going to be doing here real quick, we're also we'll have time for a call or two after this, maybe. So specifically for Tarif, if you want to call in now, I will take your call. I will make gosh darn sure of it. But we're going into a sort of extended recap, just clips of Biden and Trump from last night. In case you didn't hear this, here are some of the highlights from last night's dueling town halls with Biden on ABC, Trump on NBC in lieu of an actual debate.
Right.
Let's play these clips, Andre. Let's play this.
Did you take a test on the day of the debate, I guess is the bottom line?
I probably did, and I took a test the day before and the day before, and I was always in great shape, and I was in great shape for the debate. As president, I can't be locked in a room someplace for the next year and just stay and do nothing. And every time I go into a crowd, I was with the parents of our fallen heroes. These people are the most incredible people. And they came up to me and they would hug me and they would touch me. And I'm not going to not let them do it.
When a president doesn't wear a mask or makes fun of folks like me when I was wearing a mask for a long time, then, people say, well, it mustn't be that important.
After contracting COVID-19 yourself, has your opinion changed on the importance of mask wearing?
No, because I was okay with the masks. I was good with it, but I've heard many different stories on masks.
If you listen to the head of the CDC, he stood up and he said, while we're waiting for a vaccine, and he held up a mask. You wear this mask, you'll save more lives between now and the end of the year than if we had a vaccine.
I knew it was a big threat. At the same time, I don't want to panic this country. I don't want to go out and say, everybody's going to die.
Isn't there a middle ground? You don't have to mislead, but you can...
No, there's not a middle ground. You have to be safe, you have to be vigilant, and you have to be smart.
Besides, you ain't black. What do you have to say to young black voters who see voting for you as further participation in a system that continually fails to protect them?
Well, I say, first of all, as my buddy John Lewis said, it's a sacred opportunity, right to vote. You can make a difference. If young black women and men vote, you can determine the outcome of this election. Not a joke. You can do that.
Mr. President, what will you and your administration do to better prepare our law enforcement officers to work in collaboration with the communities that they serve, and also to protect the lives of innocent Black and Latinos from police brutality and injustice?
Right. I fully understand the question, and I saw everything that you saw over the summer, and it was a terrible thing to watch. And some people don't like it when I say it, but a lot of people agree. I have done more for the African-American community than any president, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln.
You said you don't want to ban fracking. As you know, it's an important issue here in Pennsylvania. Not everyone buys your denial. A member of the Boilermakers Local 154, Sean Stepney, was quoted in the New York Times today saying, you can't have it both ways. It says you can't meet your goal to end fossil fuels without ending fracking. What do you say to people like Sean who doubt your denial because they think you want to keep that promise?
Tell them the Boilermakers overwhelmingly endorse me, okay? What I would do is I would stop giving tax breaks and subsidizing oil. We don't need to subsidize oil any longer, number one. We should stop that and save billions of dollars over time. What I would also do with regard to, the difference between me and the new Green Deal, they say automatically by 2030, we're going to be carbon free. Not possible.
So are you for it or against it? You say you're not for it, but in your website it says you call it a crucial framework.
My deal is a crucial framework.
I'm sure they'll ask you the white supremacy question. I denounce white supremacy. Okay. And frankly, you want to know something? I denounce Antifa, and I denounce these people on the left that are burning down our cities that are run by Democrats who don't know what they're doing.
While we're denouncing, let me ask you about QAnon.
I just don't know about QAnon.
You do know.
I don't know. No, I don't know. What I do hear about it is they are very strongly against pedophilia, and I agree with that. I mean, I do agree with that, and I agree with it.
But there's not a satanic pedophile cult being run by.
I have no idea. I know nothing about that.
You don't know that? Okay.
No, I don't know that. Neither do you know that.
Okay. Just this week, you retweeted to your 87 million followers a conspiracy theory that Joe Biden orchestrated to have SEAL Team 6, the Navy SEAL Team 6, killed to cover up the fake death of bin Laden. Now, why would you send a lie like that to your followers? You retweeted
That was a retweet. That was an opinion of somebody, and that was a retweet. I'll put it out there. People can decide for themselves. I don't take a position.
You're not like someone's crazy uncle. Your own FBI director says there is no evidence of widespread fraud.
Well, then he's not doing a very good job.
If I'm elected president, you will not hear me race baiting. You'll not hear me dividing. You'll hear me trying to unify. And bring people together. When I said I was running because I wanted to unify the country, people said, well, they were the old days. We better be able to do it again. Great. We better be able to do it again.
Mr. Vice President, if you lose, what will that say to you about where America is today?
Well, it could say that I'm a lousy candidate and I didn't do a good job. But I think, I hope that it doesn't say that we are as racially, ethnically, and religiously at odds with one another as it appears.
Well, that's our debate between the President of the United States and Joe Biden, former President of the United States. We're accepting calls. Look, there are a few points. One, the defense of QAnon is strange and weird. She makes the point they're a cult of pedophiles or fighting pedophiles or whatever. And Donald Trump's like, I like that. I think that's a good thing. But I don't know anything about the other parts. Now, I don't buy that for a moment. And I don't think Savannah Guthrie bought that for a moment. Joe Biden and his conversation about voting is the one that I think probably aggravates him the most. His conversation with the African American who basically made the point of saying, you're not black if you don't vote for me. The person was clearly trying to make a point. Joe Biden responds to that by using a black person, once again, as a prop in order to cover himself from his statement, and then acts as if voting is somehow power. Basically, that your vote can influence the election. Well, no, the vote can influence the election. The question becomes whether or not it's power in the way that he's implying. It is not. If you are voting as an African American and you have 90% of African American vote is going to go to Joe Biden, you must ask yourself the question, why don't you have power in the context of a party that you're voting for to that degree? And you need to come to this realization that part and parcel to that is because oftentimes that vote is not based on this notion of affirmative politics. It's not based on this notion of this is what we want. Meaning if you have, 7-8 million people that are infected with the virus, you're talking about medical bills, you're talking about illnesses that were extended and made worse. You're talking about an African American community that took the biggest hit from that economically and medically, disproportionately, of course, because we only make up 13% of the country. And you have a Democratic Party or African Americans who should say, we demand Medicare for all. And fact of the matter is, it is impossible for a Democrat to get elected. Joe Biden has zero chance to get elected without the African American vote voting for him to the tune of that number. And yet, powerlessness, weakness. Why? Because leverage is not found in cowardice. And at the end of the day, as long as you accept the argument, if you have nowhere else to go, then despite being infinitely necessary to get a candidate in office, you have no power otherwise, meaning to affect what those candidates want. And the belief, the ridiculous belief, that just because you vote for a candidate, that candidate is going to turn around and do favors for you is nonsense. That's not the way politics works. I mean, there's several parts that we can go to on this. But at the end of the day, the job of a candidate is to get your vote. If you're going to invert the political process, then you no longer have a representative government. If 80% of the population is voting for a guy because he's not the other guy, not for an affirmative reason of he's going to do this or he's going to do that, but entirely because he's not somebody else, then you've lost your government. You've lost all notion of a representative, or for that matter, a democratic system. And I find that to be the most appalling answer. Yeah, I have issues with Joe Biden. And my issues around Joe Biden revolve around this notion of him using blacks as props, whether it's George Floyd or Blake. And both of those, to some degree, was caused by the behavior of Joe Biden over the course of the last 47 years of his terms in office. Shane, what were the things that jumped out to you in this? I mean, it was nothing said that was helpful or beneficial, but maybe you had a different perception of this.
I think it was ridiculous. But for some reason, particularly Trump stood out to me there. I mean, maybe because they were focusing on him and they kind of ignore Biden's gaffes. But with Trump here, particularly, he really should have pivoted on QAnon. This is a problem with Trump's base, frankly, but it's also a problem with Trump, the candidate. He has a bunch of people in his base who have extreme outlandish views. They're very prominent about it. I don't know what percentage they make up of his base, but the advice he should be getting should be to expand his base, and he should be doing that better. I mean, I know that the media is kind of against him whole hog at this point, including to a decent degree Fox. But on the other hand, he hasn't played this well. We do, however, have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on?
How y'all doing, gentlemen? I got 5 quick comments. It's quick. Evil Bullet and Vanessa Billy, invite them on. The Who, flip-flop on the lockdowns. They also should be taken to court because the world's facing 30-minute starvation for the next 3 weeks to months. Africa should take them to court and find out who wanted lockdowns. Budesonide inhaling steroids seem to work good against COVID-19. They should study trials with it. Please call the DOJ hotline to get the case released on the Russian hoax dealing with the Durham investigation, everyone. And also send it to Lindsey Graham in the Senate Judicial Committee. Please call those hotlines. And my last one, since the Rubicon was crossed, dealing with social media, since they want to cross, stop people from free speech, stop the New York Post, this is what Trump should do now. Release the documents on JFK assassination, MLK assassination, Malcolm X, and Robert F. Kennedy. And just release it through Twitter and Facebook. I want to see if they're going to stop that. If they stop that, they're going to have a whole bunch of people going to be mad with them. That's all I got to say.
Tarif, thank you for the call. Appreciate the call, man. We've got to go into a break right now. We will be back in 1 minute. We're talking with Danny Scherzen. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any
No, Danny.
necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
No, Danny.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And by the way, you can listen to us on the radio, specifically if you're in Washington, D.C. and Kansas City. Or I should have said or Kansas City. If you're in Washington, D.C. and Kansas City at the same time, we should have a drink sometime because you've got some powerful technology on your end there that lets you straddle those very far off parts of the country with 1 foot in one and 1 foot in the other. Anyway, if you're in D.C., we're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. You can also catch us online. We are on audio platforms such as the Sputnik News app. Do a search for that and you'll find it. We're also on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. Good ways to find us. And then last but not least, if you want to, go over to YouTube and do a quick search for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Either of those searches will bring you to our two competing live channels. Jamarl's feed has video. Both feeds have vibrant chat rooms. You should go check them out. But without further ado, we're joined now by former Major Danny Scherzen. Danny, how are you doing this morning?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us. For those listening, he is a retired U.S. Army officer and former history instructor at West Point. That's Danny Scherzen, that is. You can follow him on Twitter at SkepticalVet. That's again, SkepticalVet. And you should check out his podcast, Fortress on a Hill. He co-hosts that with fellow vet Chris Henriksen. Danny, thank you again for being with us. I wanted to start it off here, actually. I went over to antiwar.com yesterday. I saw that you have an upcoming event. I believe it's coming this Monday at Smedley Butler's gravesite in Westchester, Pennsylvania. You're going to be doing this, I believe, with the editorial director of Anti-War, Scott Horton. Can you tell us a little bit about the event, and then maybe we can move from there? Who is Smedley Butler? Who is this figure? Why are you doing it on his gravesite?
Well, first of all, the the group that organized it is bringourtroopshome.us. It's really comes out of sort of the Pacific Northwest, Mountain West initially. These are anti-war veterans. These aren't necessarily like, your standard hippie peaceniks. A lot of these people are sort of vaguely conservative, somewhat populist, a real range of folks. But they've had enough of the wars. They served in them. They fought in them. They want them to end. Whoever ends it, they don't care if it's Trump or they don't care if it's a Democrat. They just want the wars to end. And they organized this event, and they invited me to come speak at the graveside of Smedley Butler. And the reason we're doing it now is, the week of the 19th anniversary of America's longest war by far in Afghanistan. But we're going all the way to Westchester, Pennsylvania, which is right outside Philadelphia, because that's where Smedley Butler's body, ghost, soul, you name it, is. And Smedley Butler is probably the most profound road to Damascus convert from, militarism to anti-war activism in American history. And he was a major general in the Marine Corps who was in the military for 33 years, fought in 10 different war deployments in a variety of locations, was shot, and is in a very, very, very small group. In that, he won the Congressional Medal of Honor not once, but twice. Rises to the highest then available rank in the Marine Corps, retires, had already begun to get skeptical, and goes on a 10-year nearly speaking tour, writing tour, cross-country against the very wars and the very sort of institutions he had fought for, famously writing his, essay-length track, War is a Racket, where he said he had been a gangster for capitalism and that really the whole thing had been a lie, including the First World War. And it took a lot of courage. The fact of the matter is he worked himself to death. I mean, he literally worked himself into the hospital with exhaustion. He lost about 30 pounds. This is a man who could have rested on his privileges and adulations and instead literally worked himself to the point of failure in his body. So a real hero, and that's why we're going there to make a statement about this war in Afghanistan, because he certainly, Smedley Butler, would have been against this 10 years ago.
Wait, I'm going to let Shane jump in on this, but he also protected FDR, right? Like a coup attempt on FDR, if I remember this correctly.
Right. Well, so there's always been some contested historical debates about this, but for the most part, there's agreement that it's somewhat corroborated. He was apparently, as a general, he was already anti-war. He was already writing in the mid-30s during the Depression. There were some business leaders, particularly like high-level corporate sort of corrupt folks who didn't like FDR's New Deal and some of the minimal redistribution of wealth and attempts at Social Security and such. So they approached him to essentially run like a vigilante army that would look not unlike, sort of the brown shirts in fascist Germany or the black shirts in Italy. And he kind of blows the whistle on it. Of course, he listens just long enough to figure out the conspiracy of this coup. Of course, refuses to, and then makes a statement saying that he'll raise 100,000 men on the other side if he needs to, and march on Washington. That like if he's going to lead an army in a civil war or whatever, it's going to be on, say, sort of the democracy side or representative democracy side. So he was almost prepared to be like the leader of the Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War. But it's interesting that they reached out to him. I think the reason is, A, they obviously misunderstood his politics and principles, but also he was that popular. He was that famous at the time, even though he's forgotten today. In the 1930s, he was one of the, top 10 more followed figures in America at the time.
Just to follow up on that real quick, what do you think led to his loss in popularity? Why do you think that happened?
The Second World War, really. And I think this is important. What's the dirtiest word in American foreign policy history today? Isolationism. And it really tainted everything. I mean, World War II ruined so much. I mean, I believe it had to be fought, but unfortunately, sometimes when you win a war, it's almost worse than losing it, because then you start to think that war, counts, that war, it works and it's the best thing. And so it's the last war we won, but he had basically opposed getting involved in European affairs. And I think ultimately he turned out to be wrong on that point, although I think he was right about just about everything else. But one must understand that in the 1920s and 30s, his position that America should essentially mind its own business and protect its own shores was vastly popular and was totally understandable given the fact that we had been lied into the First World War with rhetoric and by bankers who had floated loans and the arms industry to fight a war that really was not on behalf of freedom, as we said. I mean, it was one of the First World War is often forgotten, but it's like one of the great charades in American history, right? And it's like our third most bloody war. So from his perspective and from the perspective of many veterans, never again was the call. And so he's right about his rhetoric about what's the military-industrial complex. Before anyone had coined that term, Smedley was talking about it. He was right about imperial banana wars and interventions overseas. He'd been in 9 of them, and then his 10th deployment was the First World War. But because he was seen as having not been strong enough in his position on the Nazis and being so anti-interventionist, he was easily sort of wiped with that brush of he's an appeaser, he is an isolationist, he wasn't strong enough on the Nazis. And the fact that he died right before intervention into the Second World War, I think we got a new crop of heroes, Eisenhower and MacArthur and Bradley. And so Smedley Butler kind of disappears to history.
That is sad. That's a tragic course of events there. I mean, this actually ties into something I was wondering about, Danny. Thank you for joining us, and thank you also for your service. I know that that's a weird thing possibly to hear or to say because we're both against war. This kind of ties into something, though. You're doing this, in some sense, in commemoration of him and of Smedley Butler's vision. But I want to hear you talk about. I didn't serve in the service. I've never done that. Never really wanted to. What perspective do veterans have on war? It seems like they would have this unique thing. You can talk about it far more eloquently and with far more knowledge than I do. But it seems to me like you become a part of this system. There's a great degree of camaraderie from what I hear. You get emotionally invested in it. And then usually, through this process, you start to see some serious atrocities. You probably join because in some sense you're idealistic to a degree. And then that idealism, I'm guessing, for a lot of people gets undone. But at the same time, you have this complicated package of emotions. And anyway, it seems like people who've been in the military have the most perspective, have the truest perspective in some sense, even though it's warped and distorted. They have the experiential perspective. They have that real degree of knowledge about the costs of war, about the sacrifices, about how it shapes society. They're the people who would be thinking and reading and writing about this stuff. Anyway, I'm probably misrepresenting in some ways, but Danny, I just wanted to hear you talk about that for a second. From Smedley Butler to you and the people that you're working with here, what should I know? What should our listeners know?
Well, I think that veterans and military folks are highly adulated and held in an enormous amount of esteem in the United States today. That provides like a platform and a credibility. On one sense, I sort of reject that, and I fear, I'm fearful of it because it can lean in the direction of like a fetishization of militarism. However, I live in the world as it is, and I do think there's value to be gleaned from going to war and seeing it. And I think that if there's a platform available for having been a veteran, then it becomes a duty as the veteran to use it for good. But I think the point here is that, look, not all veterans come back from a war and then do something about fighting against war. Like not every veteran comes back and becomes anti-war is my point. I'd say like in my anecdotal sphere of a few hundred guys that I've stayed in touch with on one level or another, probably about 40% just still like hate, the Arabs and the Muslims and the Afghans and just can't stand them and blame them for everything awful that happened to us. About 50% are just apathetic or nihilistic. And I understand that too. They're just like, they feel like we're up against this beast. Yes, I don't really think we can win, but this is a job. I'm like a professional soldier. And then I think that last 10% gets kind of participatory in their patriotism, as I say in my book. And the point there is, even if it's a minority, it's often been a vocal one. And you can trace the tradition all the way back to Washington's army, to the Continental Army. There has been dissent within the military ever since. And even though it's a small core group, it can help to know that you're in good company historically, even if you feel lonely in life in that moment, which is probably why a lot of my soulmates are dead writers, but it does help to know that that's there. And so there is a line from Smedley Butler to Vietnam veterans against the war, to Iraq veterans against the war, and all the way back to the Continental Army. And I think that's important to understand. Veterans are not a monolith.
You know what? We're going to go into a break. Danny, thank you for joining us. We'll be back with Danny Scherson in a second. He's a retired U.S. Army officer and a former history instructor at West Point. And again, you can follow him on Twitter at Skeptical Vet. Also, check out his podcast, Fortress on a Hill, that he co-hosts with fellow vet Chris Henriksen. We will be back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you out of our station in Washington, D.C. on Radio Sputnik. We're joined by Danny Scherson, retired U.S. Army officer and former U.S. history instructor at West Point, in addition to author of several books, Patriotic Descent, America in the Age of Endless War, and Ghost Riders of Baghdad. Welcome to the show, Danny. Thank you for joining us. We were having a conversation based on basically Smedley Butler and what it was like for him to be able to engage in that. I did want to ask another question on that, but I think I want to pivot for a bit. And I want to get into an article you wrote dealing with basically the lessons that the American soldiers or that our war planners gleaned from Nagorno-Karabakh. I thought the article was interesting, and you got into this notion of basically what they were learning about tanks, what they believed about tanks, preparedness based on fictional countries that mimic real countries. Can you discuss that? I think it's a fascinating perspective to get an American perspective on Nagorno-Karabakh. Oftentimes we've had people here who are from other countries giving their appraisal of it. How do you view that conflict, and how do you view Americans, let's say war planners, or let's say people in power, their view of the conflict?
Well, I've been following this conflict pretty closely for a number of years, but particularly with intensity since 2016. Oddly enough, because it ties to this idea of the military learning from it, I got really energized about it by an instructor at the Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, because the Army, as I note in the article about military lessons, the Army in particular has been using the Caucasus scenario as a training device, as a war planning, war gaming tool for quite a while now, since at least 2003. Going so far, it gets pretty absurd, going so far as to rename the 5 major countries of the area, including Russia and Iran, with these like fake names. But of course, the boundaries are exactly the same. So if you can read a map, it's clear who it is. And then also the descriptions of these fictional countries are exactly accurate to the current situation. There's a lot of reasons that they use it. The obvious ones are that there's a lot of different terrain. There's a lot of different strategic, sort of situations that might apply. But I think it also is because, the Army tends to like scenarios where they can, sort of play with their tanks and their toys and, prefer this like old school, more conventional style war to the, war on terrorism, insurgency, guerrillas that we've been fighting for the last 20 years. And you can read from, here till Tuesday about how much the Army misses the Cold War. And that's my point about this Nagorno-Karabakh, is that there's actual tank battles. It's a pretty conventional fight. And so therefore everyone's paying attention. I mean, there's so many articles about it, but my concern is that we look at these ongoing pieces of combat, and we learn what we want to learn, right? We see what we want to see, oftentimes in large bureaucracies. And so, the Army is taking the lesson twofold. One, okay, well, the tanks aren't doing so well, but we'll do better because our tanks are better, our training is better, our air support is better. And then the second one is, if you listen to these military officers that I quote throughout this article, the focus is on Russia somehow. That the whole point of this, the whole reason we train in the Caucasus is because that big battle that we didn't get in the Cold War, tanks on tanks, and it doesn't go nuclear, of course, which is ridiculous, is going to happen. And it's going to be in the Caucasus, perhaps. We didn't get the fight in the Ukraine. We didn't get the fight in the Fulda Gap in Germany before that in the Cold War. Maybe we'll get it coming through the lesser Caucasus range, right, in the Caucasus, or in Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so I just think it's very dangerous because while I'm interested in this conflict and I want peace there, I just do not see a role for the United States that's activist, that's interventionist, that doesn't end up worse. It's very much a first do no harm, Hippocratic oath sort of situation.
From the standpoint of military,
another side of this, Danny, why are we using? It's just why are we using this as a war game in the first place? This is not our business. Why are we preparing for war there when we're on the other side of the world? I mean, completely on the other side of the world. We're part of the Minsk group. We're part of the OSCE Minsk group. Admittedly, that's Russia, France, and the United States. So we are part of that. And we, of course, along with Russia, are the two major players in that group. Don't want to diminish France too much, but the facts, I think, are the facts. But Russia, compared to us, obviously regionally has outsized influence. Historically, of course, very, very tight degree there. Why do you think we felt the need to prepare for this, Jenny?
Because American exceptionalists in Washington read maps very differently than you or I do. See, you and I are living in the real world that's based on facts and empirical evidence. That doesn't play in the exceptionalist world. See, it looks like Nagorno-Karabakh is, 7,000 miles away, but actually it's the suburbs of D.C. That's the perspective coming out of the Pentagon, out of Congress, out of the White House, and it is always thus. So if Russia or China meddles in the South China Sea or in the sphere of former republics that border them, then we call that aggression. That's meddling. That's bad behavior. Okay, and that is unacceptable. But we, of course, have interests everywhere. Everywhere. I mean, there isn't a single place where America doesn't think that it ought to be involved in some way. And this is really dangerous sort of behavior. I think one of the reasons the Caucasus played as a scenario is we were tightening our relations with Azerbaijan. There was a lot of gas, oil pipelines coming out of the Caspian Sea that needed protecting. It was a perfect sort of scenario if you want to train on something complicated because you had two, quote, enemies, Russia and Iran, that are on either side of a, relatively, narrow corridor, almost like a mega isthmus. And then also you have Turkey off to the west. And so it's kind of like this perfect nexus of all the problems that America could potentially face, most of which they created themselves, that we've created ourselves through American policy, most of which. So I think that's why the Caucasus scenario was so relevant. And it was really, it was used throughout my career. And it's interesting. You're more likely to find an Army major who's heard of Nagorno-Karabakh than any cross-section of the American citizenry. And trust me, this is not a particularly intellectual culture here in the military. So that's a rare and instructive thing that I'm describing.
Danny, from the standpoint of military preparedness in general, we spend nearly $1 trillion on the military. A lot of that stuff is in black budget projects or special access projects that even many members of Congress don't necessarily see or engage in. That number is so extreme in regards to the amount of money that we spend. Is that indicative of preparedness? And the reason why I ask that, it's kind of like the Catholic Church. Nobody looks, and then you find, oh my God, all of this pedophilia. It's the thing of not looking and having no real way to interrogate whether or not we're getting the bang for our buck. So, for example, there was a military competition where a Danish, I believe it was a sub, ends up sinking all of these U.S. ships because of the way the sub apparently was ancient technology, and the other ships assumed that the technology wouldn't be that ancient. And so I guess it gets to the point of, are we really getting the bang for the buck? And how do we know we're getting the bang for the buck for that $1 trillion? Does that make sense? Like, we go with this notion of military preparedness, but how do we prepare in this case? And are we prepared based on the money that we're spending?
It depends what you mean by prepared. I mean, if tomorrow the world, as that kind of phrase goes, if the idea is that we're ready to fight anywhere, anytime over anybody's business, I would argue that it is an impossibility to be prepared. It is approaching infinity if this was a math problem, which is just how the defense industry wants it, right? Prepare for every war, every place, forever, because if like the universe, the defense budget is ever expanding, which is basically the best analogy, then you're always going to have a job, right? You're always going to, have plenty of yachts, which is how this works. But in terms of practicality, what has that $1 trillion got us? We're not safer. Few million people are dead that didn't have to be worldwide. Hundreds of thousands of them civilians, babies, children, okay, that didn't otherwise have to die. Not all killed by the American army, but many, and also killed in the wars we set off. We are not safer. Millions have died. 7,000 soldiers are dead. We're in more debt than ever before, unprepared for a pandemic, doing almost nothing about climate change. This is what you got. This is what that $1 trillion got you. Salute the flag, clap for your soldiers in the Jumbotron, but we haven't won a war. I mean a real war since 1945. Take that. These generals that we bowed down to as a society and fetishized, they ain't won a thing except maybe a training exercise in the desert of California. So pin some medals on them, right? Bow down to them. But the reality is, it's not all their fault. They've been asked to fight a lot of impossible battles. I think that the bang for the buck, the risk reward, the cost benefit, the juice, the squeeze, choose your analogy. There has been no more absurd one, probably in modern American history, than the defense budget. It is a lie. It's not about your soldiers who make 30 grand a year to die overseas. It's about somebody else. It's about somebody else. And they don't go to the same schools as you, and they don't vacation in the same place. Okay? These are massive million and billionaires, and that's the reality. So no, the bang for the buck is not there. It is not doing what it's supposed to do as far as they tell us, but it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do in terms of enriching the military-industrial complex.
Danny, this is a lot of the stuff we're talking about. There's just cause to feel very angry about. And a lot of people, obviously, I think most people are by and large anti-war in a deep sense. If you were to take them into a zone where there's active conflict going on, if they knew that American bombs were being dropped and that people were being killed overseas because of us, because of our decisions, they would be distraught. Is one word to say it. If they were put there, even if they weren't themselves endangered, if they saw what was going on, they would be deeply against it. This comes, of course, as many Americans, are left in the dark. They don't know about it. The media doesn't talk about it. And knowing that, I think a lot of people, a lot of members of our audience, a lot of the guests we have, including I'm assuming yourself, feel some degree of justified anger about this whole scenario. But I want to ask you, what should we do with that in our last minute or two? If you're feeling angry, who should we blame? Is there some better emotion to feel? It's kind of a complicated thing, but in about a minute, Danny, what's your take?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of days when I feel a combination of anger and something that I think is even more problematic, which is, apathy, fatalism, this idea that you can't do anything about it. I think we have to reject that because even in an absurd universe, right? Camus says, then, the struggle itself is enough to warm a man's heart. And we have to imagine Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill as happy. So, look, we have to redirect that into some version of activism, to each according to his sort of ability, not to go all Marxist, get in your streets, get involved in a political campaign or reject it and, sort of try to start something new besides the duopoly. But if we're not educating ourselves first and then participatory patriotic dissent, then I think that we're failing ourselves, and it's an obscene lack of duty.
Danny, I want to thank
Danny,
you, man.
thank you so much for joining us. Great
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me
conversation.
on.
For those listening, absolutely. For those listening, that was former Major Danny Schurzan. You can find him on Twitter at Skeptical Vet. Also check out his podcast, Fortress on a Hill, with fellow vet Chris Henry Henriksen. We will be back in 1 minute. We're talking Bolivia with Sputnik correspondent Wyatt Reed, who is there. Talking with him on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from across the divided states of America, the most disruptive show in those states. In the politically independent corner, I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, we are Fault Line with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, now normally we do headlines 3 times each morning, normally at 9 a.m. Eastern. That's now. I would be doing another batch of headlines, but we've got something more important to do. There's plenty of news, but we actually have a Sputnik News analyst and producer, and in this case, a correspondent. I will use that word. He travels around sometimes. Wyatt Reed is a producer for By Any Means Necessary. That airs on Radio Sputnik from Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. That, by my math, is 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific, if like me, you're on the West Coast. But without further ado, Wyatt, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing all right, Shane. How about yourselves?
Good. Thank you for being with us. All right, I'll just start it like this. What's going on with the election in Bolivia?
Well, a little bit too soon to say. Bolivians are headed to the polls here in 2 days. The campaign season has officially ended, which means that now various candidates are prohibited from continuing to campaign at this point. Going forward, they've imposed a lot of restrictions, as they do in many Latin American countries in the run-up to elections, where basically, in many ways, the society has essentially been somewhat restructured to prevent influence or malign influence in the elections, and this includes some things that are straightforward, and others like a ban on the sale and consumption of alcohol for the next 72 hours has just gone into effect. So we're in a little bit different of a moment now, this sort of stage of the electoral season. It's very difficult to say exactly what will happen because the race is so close. Now, former economic minister under Evo Morales, Luis Arce, has been a strong, consistent frontrunner in this race for a while. The question, of course, remains whether or not he will have enough of a lead to preempt a second round of voting by getting a 10-point advantage over his closest runner-up. And that, in this case, that would be Carlos Mesa, who's presenting himself as kind of a centrist candidate, although historically did come to power through more right-wing elements. And generally speaking, when we look at his political platform, I think that's closer to what we find, as is often the case with, I think, with centrists. So in this sense, there are a lot of questions still in the air. and a lot of questions about the validity of the vote. As we know, in last year's election, accusations of fraud coming from the Organization of American States were used to justify the ouster of Evo Morales. In this election, it seems clear to many that there are likely to be attempts to influence the outcome of the election through more nefarious means, but we just don't know yet where it'll happen, how much of it will happen, and to what extent it will be caught.
Wyatt, let me ask you this. I mean, this is, like you said, this set the context. Massive election. There was a coup that took place the prior year. The New York Times, a day late, dollar short, comes out and even calls it that at this point when it's clear that Evo Morales actually was winning. And for the public in America to understand it by 10 points, like, put that in context. But imagine for the moment, Donald Trump beating Clinton by a score of 50-40. The public would be shocked by that. It would be a landslide of epic proportions. And that guy was taken out of office. Meaning the guy who won by that much is the guy that gets dragged out of office in a coup by a bunch of theocratic fascists screaming about democracy. So this election is basically the culmination of that the coup government is the government that is supposed to be running with an election, and now it's going to be determined whether or not the public is going to say yay to that coup government. What is the polls looking like at this point? I mean, is it looking basically like that government is going to lose? And is it understood that the government is going to leave even if they do lose? I mean, all of these things I would imagine are questions, right?
That's totally right. And even with respect to the polls themselves, we have the same issues in the United States, I think, where if you look at the polls in 2016, virtually everybody was predicting a Hillary Clinton win. And lo and behold, little Donald Trump comes along out on top. And I think a big part of this was these sort of silent voters, these hidden voters, who may not have been willing to publicly embrace their candidate of choice for fear of some kind of social retribution, perhaps. We have sort of a weird and inverse sort of situation occurring here from my perspective, where many voters who are extremely sympathetic to the Mas party and who would otherwise want to vote for them because they see a more clear sort of convergence of interest there between themselves and between the party, are not terribly willing to do so, at least publicly. And part of the reason is that in the aftermath of the ouster of Morales, there was a significant change in editorial line at many media outlets. Those that were not already right-leaning very quickly fell into that camp. So when you turn on the TV in Bolivia, it's virtually impossible to find any positive coverage of the left-wing party. Most of what you hear is crafted and written and explained through a fairly right-wing conservative lens. And this is something that when the entire media is arranged in such a way, well, obviously you're not going to hear about it. So it may be more obvious to me or to you all as outside observers that this change has taken place. But for sort of normal working Bolivians, it's like working Americans. You turn on the TV, and if it's on, and you just have it in the background, and it's how it's informing you, telling you what's happening, and you're not necessarily aware of the editorial policy of its owners. So we definitely are in a time right now of yes, great uncertainty. There's just so much that could happen, and it's a little bit too early to predict. But yeah, it's very, very exciting and very sort of nerve-wracking time for many people here.
We're speaking with Sputnik producer and correspondent Wyatt Reed, who's in Bolivia right now covering the election there. By the way, we're taking calls. If you'd like to call in with a question for him, you can. The number is 202-521-1320. Wyatt, you were just talking about media swinging far to the right after the ouster of Morales. What if the socialists win? What do you think the consequences are going to be for the country? How do you think that would be, I would guess, a huge shakeup? It would dramatically impact a lot of things. You swing far in one direction and suddenly you're swinging pretty far back in the other direction. And just to use that simple physical metaphor, that's gonna leave the contents of that country rattling. What would happen, Wyatt?
Well, it's an excellent question. And again, one that we definitely have to leave in the realm of speculation right now, but of course I'm happy to do so. We would likely see a significant rise sort of in the fortunes of the union elements, organized indigenous elements would be re-empowered in a fairly significant way. A number of media outlets that were either state-owned or controlled by those factions would be returned to their previous owners. So that would shake up the media landscape quite a bit. Economically, the Bolivian current sort of self-styled interim government has just managed to finally secure this massive $340 billion IMF loan that seems to be, it's difficult to say right now that they have really any mandate to do this. Obviously, they have been acting fairly freely in terms of that mandate, despite never having been elected. We see not just not being elected,
losing by 10 points. Basically, they're trying to lock the country into an IMF loan after losing the election by 10 points. And so when the next government comes in, that next government is basically stuck trying to deal with a loan that the previous government, the one that won by 10 points, would have most likely never taken. Is that basically what we're talking about?
Pretty much, yes. It's $340 million is a lot of money for a country like Bolivia. And it's something that has been pushed through against the objections of the Bolivian Congress, Bolivian Senate, who remain under the control of the MAS party, have been doing sort of everything in their power to prevent the unelected government from pushing the country back into this kind of international loan shark situation. It also points, I think, to a kind of shifting of the electoral norms, of the political and legislative norms, in the sense that it's hard for me as a U.S. citizen to imagine that the president could push through this kind of a massive package without the willingness of Congress. And in Bolivia, generally, decisions of this magnitude require a 2/3 majority. In this case, the interim government of Janine Áñez, which it should be noted is not even running for another term, but is nonetheless pursuing and now apparently receiving this massive loan, will not even be able to administer it. It seems like a bit of a white elephant, to put it mildly.
Absolutely. You know what? We've got about a minute left, but I want to ask the sort of inverse of the last question that I asked. What will happen if the socialists lose? What will happen if the right wins?
I think we'll simply see a continuation of the past 11 months. We will see further likely indebtedness of the country on an international scale. We will see further attempts to privatize nationally owned industries. We will see quite likely return to the sort of neoliberal governance that characterized Bolivia both during and well after the years of dictatorship. So I can't say that I would be terribly optimistic about the future of Bolivia for working Bolivians in such a scenario. But again, all of this remains to be seen, whether or not the right wing can cement their hold on power, or whether or not the working peoples behind the socialist movement will be able to make their voices heard in such a way that they can come back into power without setting off sort of a civil wars type scenario, which it's hard to imagine that having done so much to get in power that the right wing would relinquish it that easily. But we shall see.
We shall. You know what, Wyatt? Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Yeah, for those listening, Wyatt Reed is a Sputnik News analyst and a producer for By Any Means Necessary, which airs on Radio Sputnik Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. And by the way, you can follow him on Twitter at Wyatt Reed 13. That's Wyatt spelled WYATT REED. That's the Reed part. And then the numbers 1 and 3. Wyatt Reed 13. You can also, of course, listen to BAM By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific. We will be back in just a minute. We're talking with Manila Chan, veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program In Question. We're going to be talking about these dueling town halls last night. Also libertarianism, whether libertarianism as a political philosophy and ethical philosophy is the answer. Whether it helps, whether it hurts, should be an interesting conversation. We'll be back with her in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Shane Stranahan. I am joined by my co-host, Jamarl Thomas, and we're joined also by our guest, Manila Chan. She's a veteran news anchor and the host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. Manila, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning, guys. I stayed up past my bedtime to watch these dueling town halls, but it was flat, unfortunately.
I'll be honest. Yeah, that does not. I think a lot of people, a lot of us are in the same boat. But like you're saying, it was flat, and this follows. I'm just going to start it up here, I guess. What do you think of? We've had these, first 3 political events. Obviously, last night was not a debate; it was these dueling town halls because the debate was canceled, which could be its own topic of conversation. But maybe we can go back to the first one. How do you feel about how this whole process has played out with the first presidential debate, the vice presidential debate, and now this sort of surrogate, separate debate, where instead of being divided by a plexiglass window, they're doing their own things completely. Manila, what's your take?
Okay, first, if we go back to, 2 weeks ago, for the first presidential debate, I'll only touch on that briefly. And that's to say how disappointed I was, because that was probably the least informative presidential debate ever. Not in modern times, I just mean ever. I mean, you can go back, probably to the Roosevelt days and when they were all doing this on radio. This was literally the least substantive debate, if you want to call it that. It was just kind of, two angry old white men yelling at each other and telling each other to shut up, or calling the other guy.
Possibly the least substantive debate in any country ever. I just want to add that in, not just in America.
Yeah. Let's just say the least substantive debate ever, period. No ifs, ands, or buts, no conditions, just the worst thing ever in terms of presidential debate. Nothing came out of that. Nobody learned anything new. Nobody learned any policy. Nobody learned any plans about the future. So then, fast forward 2 days, 3 days, and President Trump has COVID at this point. So I get it. I get the reluctancy to want to hold a, in-person debate. That makes sense. And it's also within President Trump's prerogative to say, well, I'm not going to take part in a virtual debate because I agreed to an in-person debate. So I can see his point there. That's fair, and that's fine. But then if we fast forward to just last night, to have these two dueling, if you want to call them town halls, I think they were just dog and pony shows because, again, this goes to show this wasn't a debate problem, that both these men had no substance. They didn't have anyone to debate with, and they still didn't really put forth any kind of substantive information about what they plan to do for Trump the next 4 years or what a first-term Biden presidency would look like. I mean, I will admit Joe Biden being, a almost 50-year politician, he had a little more polish. He had, I would say, a pretty good night compared to some of the gaffes he's made on the campaign trail. He had a pretty decent night, and he's a little more polished and able to kind of, sort of, put forth a vision, maybe. President Trump speaking on platitudes like he normally does. But what really annoyed me as a viewer, and I'm sure a lot of people can get behind me on this, is that they put it on at the exact same time. So I think there are a lot of people who want to see whether or not it's going to change their vote. I don't know. But I think a lot of people wanted to watch both of them. And for a lot of people, they don't have DVR. That is a luxury item.
The sad part about this is that Savannah Guthrie was sitting across from Donald Trump. And so the idea that the two couldn't debate goes out the window the moment that happens. And both were sitting without masks. Yeah. Both were having a conversation. Now, from my standpoint, I think Donald Trump was perfectly right in saying, I don't want to have a virtual debate where you could just turn me off, especially if from his standpoint, it's a weakness. Meaning his strength is being there. His strength is not necessarily being on a virtual environment. Joe Biden, to his point, I honestly put it on him that the debate didn't take place. I mean, yes, there's all sorts of means that they could have come out in order to, legitimize the fact that Trump was clean. They could have had multiple independent doctors. They could have had all sorts of ideas that could come to fruition. Joe Biden didn't want to have that debate, is what I think it boils down to, for obvious reason that he is so far ahead, at least in his head, regarding the polling, that it becomes an unnecessary thing. And so for him, it is just easier to have a town hall. What do you think about that? That part and parcel to the reason the debate didn't take place is because Biden just didn't want the debate to take place.
Jamarl, I think this is like the first time you and I completely agree.
Yes!
I think I'm all for consensus, and I wish our politicians would follow that mindset, because I agree. Like I mentioned off the top, is that President Trump had initially agreed to an in-person debate, and you're right. His strength comes from being live and in person. He is a showman. Whether he's a real estate mogul, whatever, fine. But at the end of the day, he has been in the public eye for 40 plus years. He is a showman. He comes from a place of bravado, and that's where people turn on. They want to watch that bravado on stage. And we saw a little bit of that with, Savannah Guthrie. If you compare her performance to George Stephanopoulos's, they couldn't be more different. Savannah was, I think you can kind of tell that she didn't really like President Trump because she was kind of disrespectful in kind of spouting things off in a manner that you probably wouldn't address any other president of any country.
Well, give me an example.
Whereas George Stephanopoulos, oh gosh, I mean, she kind of barked at him a couple of times. I can't even remember any one off the tops, in particular. But there were several times where I get pushing back. I've done the same job as her. You can push back in a respectful manner. She literally would cut in and interject and kind of just yell at him.
This is fascinating because I think it gets to what seems to be different with Trump, which is an undermining of the authority of the office. Meaning, and look, to some degree, this may be just because of the way Trump himself has acted, where he himself, I would argue, diminished the office in some of the things that he said or the way that he's behaved. But
it's also Chris Wallace, the way he interacted with Chris Wallace during their the first debate. I imagine she was sort of thinking of that. She was thinking how she should be responding in this adversarial environment.
Yeah, well, that, but also this notion that they have done such a job of trying to delegitimize Trump, as if Trump didn't get in office on his own steam. Now, Trump did that to Obama with the birth certificate stuff. And so, to some degree, good for goose, good for gander. But I think in this case, though, it has had such monstrous repercussions in regards to the relationship with Russia and foreign countries and the way that they attacked him, and he turned around and attacked Russia. But I'm getting to this thing of delegitimization and the way that people engage him. Or is it like Shane said, that basically he acted a particular way himself that encouraged her to behave that way towards him?
I would largely agree with that, but you would hope with Savannah Guthrie's extensive professional background that she would be able to be better composed under any circumstances. If you turn the channel, which I did, I flipped back and forth, then you listen to George Stephanopoulos, and I get it. He's dealing with Biden, who, again, is a polished politician. He's been doing this a long time. It was so much more tame that it came off like there was some sort of substance. But there wasn't really. If you really listen to what he said, it was good presentation. We know that President Trump isn't a typical politician. He's a newcomer to this industry, if you want to call it that, because I would say it is. But President Trump is, a showman, and he doesn't know or care of the decorum that comes with the office or comes with public service or comes with being a politician. I don't think he actually cares. And yes, while he thrives from his own bravado and beating his chest, I was a little disappointed with Savannah Guthrie because I expected more from her, that she would kind of keep it contained, but not in such an abrupt and unusual manner for her style of journalism. George Stephanopoulos really calm, controlled. He pushed back in a very respectful way. And outside of these two town halls, I would say that the two of them are generally pretty comparable in terms of presenting and how you deal with world leaders. I've seen them both conduct interviews over the past, 15 years, 20 years. And they're both usually pretty mild-mannered. Last night was an unusual performance for Savannah, and I don't think it's fair to put her behavior on President Trump, because you as a journalist, it is up to you to keep your cool and try to rein it back. And I will agree that Chris Wallace really just seemed like the substitute teacher in a classroom, and he had these two boys fighting with each other and he couldn't get them to stop. I get that she didn't want that to happen, but there was a better way to go about it.
I agree. You know what? Another side of this that we haven't talked about, NBC came under pressure to cancel this. To boycott NBC was a hashtag floating around. The idea there being not just that they were running it at the same time as they were going to be running Biden's town hall slot. So, they'd be competing, like you were saying, leaving folks either to record one and watch it later, or they just switch back and forth and kind of miss out on both of them. But of course, the other side of it was NBC's hosting Trump. People were pushing back against NBC just for hosting President Trump, giving him a platform, quote unquote, whatever. Admittedly, that was like a more marginal complaint than the other, but I did see that. So I can see her getting pressure just emotionally from that. But like you're saying, she's a professional. She's there to sort of steward this historical process, and she should have risen to that role. You know what? We've got to go into a break, Manila. We're going to come back with you in just a minute. For those listening, Manila Chan, veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. By the way, you can follow her on Twitter. Just go check her out, twitter.com/Manila Chan. Also on Facebook at Manila Chan Reports. You can also watch her show In Question on RT America. We will be back with Manila in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our guest, Manila Chan. She's a veteran news anchor and the host of RT America's daily news program, In Question. Manila, thanks again for being with us. I saw when I was going over to your feed the other day, I saw you'd posted something about libertarianism. It's this chart. I'm not going to try to do the full summary here, but it's basically a chart painting out left positions, traditionally Democrat positions, right positions, traditionally Republican positions, and then libertarian positions, like representing this vast swath of positions in between the two parties. We've been having a bunch of conversations about the idea of a third party, of an alternative to this sort of two-party duopoly that we're in. And we have a couple of libertarian guests on, and we talk with them about this stuff. But I wanted to get your take. I'm curious. I'll just start it off here. Where do you see yourself standing politically, Manila?
I've always been a registered independent ever since I was 18 years old, because I could never really get in line with everybody in California where I grew up is a Democrat. They're Democrats. It's a blue state. But I couldn't really get in line with that because I was coming of age during the Clinton era and the scandal and what have you. And I went into a deep dive into what President Clinton's policy actually looked like. And while at that time, the Democrat Party of the 90s was, harping about the middle class, which I think a large swath of people my age, we grew up in the middle class, and they harped about that and being, helping the poor, stopping wars and what have you. But then you dig a little deeper, and again, I came of age during the NATO bombings of Yugoslavia and how much President Clinton actually lied to the American people. It really disenchanted me from going left and being a registered Democrat, like the majority of people in my family. But then I looked at the right at the time, and, if you consider historically the very, very conservative values, the, anti-homosexuality, anti-gay marriage, all these anti things, I couldn't get with that either. Lo and behold, I found libertarianism. While I'm not a registered libertarian, I wanted to reserve the right to have a choice. California had an open primary, so when you're an independent, you can vote in whichever party you wanted. It's kind of different from state to state, obviously, but that's how, for me, I found that this made sense. Because as unsexy as it sounds, I think a large swath of Americans really can actually agree with libertarian positions, because most people are relatively pretty moderate. You might say, I don't want to do nation building, but I also want to protect our country from attacks. I think we should have guns, but I think there should be some gun control. It seemed like the Libertarian Party was somewhere in the middle, and that fit nicely for me. And growing up to become a journalist, it really saddened me to see how it's not just like this is the 1/3 party, right? There's so few people that run outside of the left or the right. They just call everybody else third party. So to me as a journalist, that really saddens me that we scoop all of these different people, these different parties, these different beliefs, these different values, and you scoop them all into one lump, put them in one basket, and call them a spoiler. They're spoilers from the right. They're spoilers from the left. Nobody seems to look at Ross Perot. He was probably the most famous quote unquote spoiler. To me, I think that is such a sad thing for our democracy that most people really believe that the duopoly exists. They don't like it, but yet they subscribe to it and they continue to create this monster and make it bigger and bigger to where we're seeing these farthest swings of people's beliefs on the far, far left and then the far, far right. But when the heart of Americans, and I was on the campaign trail in 2016. I got to go tour around following the Clinton campaign, and then I toured around following the Trump campaign. And when you actually start talking to people in all these different states, you find out that when you're not talking to the extreme voters, the majority of everyday people are kind of somewhere in the middle. And the media does such a poor job. They do such a poor job of representing all of those people. They trick you into believing there's a it's a scam. They trick you into believing that there's a binary choice. You choose the GOP or you choose the Democrats. It's blue or red, one or the other. That is not the case. Our country is founded on the belief of a spectrum of colors, of political ideology, political philosophy. And right now in 2020, we have lost sight of that. And that is why we continue this duopoly. And I think it's terrible. And the media is definitely to blame. It is shameful that I am the only person in media that has had anybody in the Green Party on. I'm in touch with the Joe Jorgensen campaign to try to have her on hopefully next week, because no one's putting these people on the debate stage. No one's giving them any airtime. I think that's absolutely shameful, and the media is to blame for this divide in this country right now. They're not showing people that you have a spectrum of choices. It's not red or blue.
1,000% agree with you. I mean, and part and parcel to that goes along with this notion of the inversion of politics that I talk about. Because I try to make the point that the moment that you turn around and you don't have a candidate trying to get your vote, but instead you're throwing yourself to the candidate as if it's your responsibility to get them elected, as opposed to the other way around. Well, at that point, you no longer have a representative government. I mean, like you said, they don't put the Green Party or the Libertarian Party on stage. I mean, if you are on the ballot, you should be on the debate stage, not this polling nonsense.
Yeah.
I mean, because how do you get the polling if people don't even see you debate the other candidates? You need them there with the other candidates in order to give them the legitimacy necessary for the public to take them seriously, because they should be taken seriously. It is not a throwaway vote. Right. They're voting for people who specifically represent their interests. Why do you think we got to that point? I mean, because like you said, yes, the two political parties clearly have an interest or self-interest in maintaining this kind of two-party duopoly nonsense, because at that point they can just bounce back and forth without having to actually take real stands and real positions. Because I do believe that part of the reason that we ended up with the two candidates that we got is because one plays against the other without having to do anything real and tangible for the population itself. How do you think we got there?
I definitely think we got there because of the media influence and the money. All the money that comes from these huge, investment firms, all these Wall Street people, and when I say people, I don't mean one specific individual. I mean, these corporations, but Wall Street and big American corporations feed a lot of money into these campaigns. The media gets a lot of money from those people. So they are going to back one or the other. The bipartisanship, well, we shouldn't even say it. I don't know. The multi-partisanship has been lost. It's become, at some point became bipartisan because it's, again, part of the language, part of the vernacular that we use to frame it as a two-party thing. We made it normal. It's normalizing a two-party system, the right and the left, calling it bipartisan. It should be multi-partisan. And I think the media is ultimately to blame for this because it went from hundreds of different newspapers not owned by all of the same people to now like 50 companies that own all the publishing that we see, all the television that we see, all the radio that we see. I mean, except for obviously Sputnik Radio. There are a few offshoots here and there, but generally speaking, all across this country, 50 giant conglomerates own all of the access that the American people are inundated with what they see, what they hear, what they see on billboards even. You can't escape them. The media is completely to blame for pushing this narrative that is just not true. And I get that some people are starting to wake up, and I'm going to not call it the woke movement because I think that's taken on a life of its own. But people have woken up to know that there are other parties. And while we go back to the 90s and see Ross Perot becoming a real contender, that was like kind of the first time in modern American history that we saw this so-called third-party fringe person actually take to a main stage and get up there and debate the incumbent and debate, somebody on the left. This is the first time that happened. And because he didn't win, the media went and called him a spoiler. And that in and of itself is what ruined it for the vast majorities of American people who would probably lean libertarian if they actually knew the party existed.
I don't think they'd lead libertarian.
It seems like...
I'm sorry.
I mean, I could see Shane, I'm sorry. Libertarian or green. I mean, frankly, it's any third party. But I mean, part of this is that a lot of this has moved online. Manila, you were just talking about media consolidation, media control of public opinion, and how the media itself is probably controlled, not probably, definitely controlled by a relatively small number of economic and political interests. So it creates this sort of self-perpetuating cycle where the political system has this huge influence on the media ecosystem. If you can call it an ecosystem, it's a closed ecosystem. And then, of course, the media has a huge influence on our political system in terms of how people vote, but also providing stories for politicians to reference when they're making their decisions. You could type polling into this anyway. The thing with this, though, is you also have the internet. You have the rise of, new media over the last couple of decades. That's come under threat recently, but, where it's sort of like you push people out and they're constantly trying to create somewhere new to congregate, some new place to have their interesting conversations. And it's this bifurcation on the one hand of the way the media works, but also on the other hand of the way our politics works. I'm curious, what's your opinion? How do you think that's going to continue? Do you think that those voices are going to be successfully suppressed? If they aren't, where do you think that's going to lead? What's your take, Manila?
Well, right now, I think that's the perfect chance for us to talk about the Twitter and Facebook gods, Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey. And if you don't mind, I'll segue myself into section 230 and the Biden emails. Right now, as you said, Shane, we have moved off of traditional television and print media onto the internet. So now you have these tech titans that basically control what you see and what you hear all day. Because for the first time in American history, or in world history rather, the media comes with us. It's not like we come home and turn on the TV in the old days or only hear radio in your car. It is in your pocket now. It follows you. It's with you every single day. Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg are there when you wake up, and they're there when you go to sleep. And they will tell you what they think is appropriate to be seen or read or heard. And I think that's a terrible precedent to set, because Section 230 needs to be, as Ajit Pai, the FCC chairman, says he's going to clarify whatever Section 230 means. I don't know what he means by clarify, because this is going to take an act of Congress to really define what these media companies actually are. Are they platforms or are they publishers? Right now, if you look at the Hunter Biden email debacle right now, the censorship from Facebook and Twitter, they are acting as publishers. And when you don't have a free media and you don't have a free internet, you are not free anymore in the 21st century. It's simple as that. These guys should not control what we see and what we hear. If we are also their product, they need to kind of appreciate us a little bit more and give us the credit to know that, maybe I'm listening to this, maybe I disagree with it, I don't like it, it's ugly, but I should have the right to listen to it, or the right to see it, the right to read it. But they don't afford that to us because they think we're too stupid to understand for ourselves. And I think that's where, I don't know what Ajit Pai is going to do about it, but somebody needs to step in and open the internet.
And this comes as, this is going to be brought up, Ajit Pai, chairman of the FCC. This comes as he is going to be releasing some summary. He's planning on releasing, I think he has a summary of the summary out right now, clarifying the meaning of Section 230. A big topic of debate. We've been talking about this. We'll talk more about it soon. Manila, that was also a perfect segue back into libertarianism. We've got to cut it short here. We've got to go. But this idea, I think libertarians espouse it the most. Don't restrict people's ability to choose, whether that's what they do, in their living lives, whether it's how they act, or whether it's what they think, what they read, what they're free to say. And that applies to our platforms too. Interesting conversation. Really appreciate you joining us, Manila.
Thank you, guys.
Absolutely. Great to have you. For those listening, that was Manila Chan, veteran news anchor and host of RT America's daily news program In Question. By the way, you can follow her on Twitter at Manila Chan. You can also follow her on Facebook at Manila Chan Reports. And you can watch her show In Question on RT America Monday through Friday. We will be back in just a minute. We're taking calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we are taking calls. The number is 202-521-1320, Again, 521-1320. That's the number. Jamarl, fascinating conversations today. I hear you had a comment that you wanted to add towards the end of that segment. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. What were you planning on talking about there?
Well, I just wanted to ask her if they shouldn't have that much control over tech. What about oil and gas or telecommunications? Or, it's like if oil and tech or if telecommunications is in this thing of, whoa, that's too much power. What about other industries? And how do you deal with it from one to the other? I was just wanting to see what she was going to say about it. Because it's the libertarianism thing. Look, I don't buy that the majority of the country would trend towards libertarianism. I mean, you can ask them what they want, and they want healthcare, single payer. Even if it's not Medicare for all, they do believe the government should take care of it. And so that flies in the face of libertarianism. Social Security would fly in the face of libertarianism. Medicare for all, Medicare in its current creation, like all of those things. Even having a school board would fly in the face of it. So I don't buy that the country will be on board for that stuff. Even though I understand where she's coming from, of like, look, my opinions aren't reflected in the candidates because the candidates realize they don't have to, and they can get in office, without having to actually cater because neither caters. So it's like you get this weird inversion of governments. But no, I understand her point. I totally feel where she's coming from on this.
Yeah, I mean, another way of putting this stuff, I'm not a libertarian, never really called myself one. And maybe at one point I did actually, but it's been a long time. The government has a role, has a significant role. But if I'm going to be in that camp, it would be with this one big reservation, which is, I would prefer a smaller government, but I would really prefer a very competent government. And frankly, that's something that seems to be left out of pretty much all of the parties. The Greens pushing for environmental issues, obviously that's deeply important. Libertarians pushing for freedom, the Democrats and Republicans pushing for who know what. If there were a party that were like trying to make government smaller and much, much, much more effective at the same time, not just relative to where it is now, but on an absolute basis, like much, much more competent at solving key problems relating to the provision of healthcare, for instance. If the government provided healthcare, but it did it with like little money and like targeted, technological progress, that kind of thing.
How do you do it?
I could see, I would go for it.
But how do you get the competent government? That's the question. I mean, I think that's the operative question. How do you get a competent? Because to me, these things are environmental. And you need to have whatever the logic your society or even the individual is operating on, it has certain outcomes. How do you get the outcome where your government is rational and is competent and it's not in this thing of just self-interest or, for that matter, their own party interests or whatever the group that their tribal interests? I think that's the question.
You would need what is, and usually when people use the term social sciences, I'm going to use the term social science. Usually when they use this term, they're not referring to what I refer to as science. They're referring to some weird amalgam of sociology and anthropology and history and a sort of overgrown academic monster that has congealed various beliefs and perspectives over the years and now tries to teach those various beliefs and perspectives, like preserving our intellectual heritage or whatever. They're not dissing it. There's a lot of value in that. And there are a lot of good ideas in there. But I think you would need, have you ever read Foundation, the book or the series Foundation, the sci-fi series Foundation?
No.
Tomorrow?
No. I wasn't a big sci-fi reader. I used to always just read physics books. That was I was a weird kid. I used to read those. But no, explain.
Science fact, not science fiction, arguably a lot more valuable. But science fiction can provide some interesting insights into society because, smart people thinking about how society could work, not just technology, but like different fundamental modes of human relations. Anyway, there was this character from Foundation. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but really there's this science of psychohistory. And it gets kind of dystopic in some sense, a little bit dystopian because they're like predicting the course of human history, determining the course of human history. But there really is something to this like deep understanding of human nature, of incentives you can pull from economics, microeconomics, deep understanding of how institutions work, how people relate to each other. And then you build up governance with that knowledge, we have not had, I'm going to put this as starkly as I possibly can, we have not had a post-scientific political order. The closest thing might be some of the stuff that you're seeing in like Estonia or even Taiwan. There are probably in China too. There's some attempts at this, but we have genuinely not had that. We are living on political operating systems that are hundreds of years old and hundreds of years out of date. And I think for that political party that I'm talking about, whether it's a political party or a movement or some new country or whatever, for it to be viable, for it to be better than the rest, you need to have a functional science. I think that's still needs to be done.
Agree.
Anyway.
1000% agree. I mean, that's Jack Fresco's argument, basically, that we're inching along based on our historical drives. And oftentimes those things built around greed, is built around tribalism. And like you say, there hasn't been this thing of us taking an appraisal of our system and saying, how do we perpetuate this in a way that is sustainable and that it's organized around human growth, human development, and human happiness? Because there is no point to life at all. We choose. And we have ended up with the choice of just working to make other people rich as opposed to working for the best interests of humanity. And I think that's the transition. We look, I think of everything on this, I think we have a 1000% agreement on. Now, let me ask you this. Is that a planned society? Is that communism? If you're going to take the moment to make an appraisal in regards to how people should function and order and operate, meaning where you can use human nature, whatever that means. I think it's water in the jar, but use this notion of this is how people behave when they're engaging with this particular environment. And we can perpetuate our society in a way that doesn't necessarily end itself, that doesn't have these upheavals of people setting things on fire and that type of things, and competent leadership. Like, is that a planned society at that point?
I think any society has to come with some planning. I'm not going to use the word communism, and I wouldn't use the word capitalism, and I'm not going to use any of those other words either, because it's almost like in the quote-unquote pre-scientific era, and arguably we're still living in it, but in that era, you had all these different theories. You know, there was the theory of the humors, that people, there were these 4 humors that people exhibited and that, you know, determined how they acted. And then we developed theories of microbiology that gave us a little bit more insight into how the body worked. I know you don't mean to, and I don't mean to be patronizing, but it's almost like the way I feel it will be is like, if you were to be asking me at the invention of microbiology, are you bilious or are you sanguine? You know, you're asking me about my humor temperaments or whatever.
I know what you mean.
It's like we have not yet come up with the real.
I'm being a bit facetious when I asked you the question, and I'm being a bit provocative because I know you're like, that's not what that is. I'm just more so getting to this point that I think the objective of China and some of these other countries is a planned society where they're trying to figure out how do we make this work. But I don't think we're there yet where we've gotten to, like you said, the scientific point where we're analyzing human behavior and we say, how do human beings behave in this environment or that environment or that environment? And which one do we want? We haven't chosen anything. We've just inched along. So let's do the calls. You're right. Let's do the calls. Michael from Sydney, you have about 30 seconds because Shane and I was going back and forth. So what's up, Michael?
I'd like to talk about. I have a lot of interesting ideas, I think. I mean, if you want to talk about libertarianism, I agree with 90% of it, with the free market stuff. You know, I agree with returning the Federal Reserve, you know, not fighting wars, you know, all that type of stuff. And I agree with, you know, like you're busting up the trust and everything. But the problem is if you have a free market, like you said, Jamal, and I totally agree, they won't have free education, the universities or school or anything like that and all the rest of it. The other problem is Karl Marx talked very early on, is one of the main points of Marxism, is the concentration and centralization of wealth and power. That's what, and information, that's what capitalism does over time. It concentrates and it centralizes wealth and power and information and opportunity in the hands of a few people. You can't have unfettered capitalism because it will just bring down everything good about libertarianism.
You know what, Michael, I agree with you fundamentally, but here's the thing. You know, in communism, you have absolute centralization of power in the commissariat or whichever party is supposed to represent the classes. In fascism, you have absolute, consolidation of power in the hands of one small ruling elite, that rules over and through this conception of an ethnic group. In any political system that I've seen on the face of this earth, other than pure anarchism, which seems non-competitive, you've got that problem. Real quick, I want to go to another caller. Sean, calling in from Maryland. Sean, you've got about 30 seconds here. What's on your mind?
Okay, I agree with the first caller, but the libertarianism thing, sometimes, like, for example, in terms of a black person, you can't exercise libertarianism until you're fully free, and we're not free. But just to say real quick, this situation has been going on. We know that it's just a thing where it's a fight between the classes. So what they do is the rich are just completely just making poor white folk and black folk, ethnic groups just fight over either race or religion.
Sean, thank you for the call. Thank you for the call. You know what? Good call. I agree with you. I think Jamarl would too. We've got to go out though. We're going into a weekend. We will be back on Monday. For everybody listening, I hope you have a lovely weekend. I also want to send a brief shout out to our producers. That's Cam and Raheem. Thank you for your hard work. Doing a great job. And also thank you so much, Engineer Andre, doing fantastically. And Jamarl, great week. You're awesome, man. Everybody listening, you're awesome too. We'll be back on Monday, signing off Fault Lines.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Guys, I want to thank you for watching, of course. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. We had a great, this was a great show the last 2 days. I thought we were definitely on point in regards to the show. I've been trying to reorganize myself in the way I go about doing this. And I think that's been doing better. It's just trying to inch your way to a better scenario and a better show, and you just as a person trying to be better at what you do. And so I do think my methodology going forward is analyzing the guests over the course of the nights in order to get an idea in my head of where to go. It's just trying to expand the amount of time you have to do the job. But no, I thought the last few days were exceptional in regards to the show. Yorick Asserman, thank you. I appreciate that. Also, there was something that somebody... There we are. Check out the Libertarian Socialist Caucus of the Lib Socialist Caucus LP. Make Libertarian Socialist again. That's the other part. If I had to describe myself as anything, it would probably be Libertarian Socialist. Now, what I mean by that is, think of it in the standpoint of, in order for you to be free, your society needs to have certain things. Meaning there is no concept of you being free if you're in need of food, of water, of clothing, of shelter, and those things are not necessarily there and available to you. Not to mention work, where you can make a choice of doing a particular job. For you to make a choice requires freedom. You can make an argument to me that society isn't fair or that nature isn't fair, but nature and all this other stuff is different from what we as conceptual human beings have in the society that we can create that is in the best interests of the whole. I hope you understand what I mean by this. It's in order for you to be free as a human being and free where you can make choices, you to some degree needs to have a society and environment that allows you to be such. And this is where the libertarian socialist thing makes more sense to me. This consolidation of power in the hands of a 1% is problematic in the sense that anything that they basically control, you basically court it off. And when you get to the point where you have massive amounts of income, any notion of freedom is out the window. The person who's working 50 hours a week or is on a hamster wheel is not free by any measure of the term. It doesn't apply in that context. So my argument is what freedom is needs to be in some conception of individuals having the things that they need as they develop and as they grow. And until that happens, freedom is not part of the mix. So yeah, libertarian socialist is, where I fall on this stuff. That's probably why I agree halfway with the libertarian argument when they make it and think the other half is utterly ghastly and impractical. But I'll end this here. Like, share, and subscribe. You guys will be seeing me throughout the course of the day. And I'll end here. Thanks all. Fault Lines. Thomas Stranahan. And the show starts on Monday again, Monday through Friday, 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern.